As the night settles in, so can you. Let us know in the comments, where are you listening this and what is your current time. After that, close your eyes if you like. Nothing we're about to discuss is urgent or even particularly interesting. And let us begin. If you ever thought ancient trade was some genteel affair with silk-clad merchants exchanging goods over polite cups of tea, think again. The Silk Road was more of a frenzied bazaar than a prim path, a chaotic web stretching over 4,000 miles from the bustling markets of Xi'an during the Han Dynasty all the way to the Mediterranean ports. This wasn't just one path, but a sprawling network of trade routes that sprawled across deserts, mountains, and empires, each with its own challenges and quirks. And it kicked off around 130 BCE, thanks to some serious diplomatic elbow-greasing by the Han Dynasty, which was keen to show off its silk and maybe score some cool spices and horses in return. Now, let's talk Han Dynasty. These folks knew how to throw a diplomatic shindig. Under Emperor Wu, they were all about expanding their horizons, not just territorially, but economically. You see, the Han were like the original networkers, sending envoys like Zhang Qian out into the wild unknown to drum up business. Zhang Qian's travels, which took him through places like Fergana and Bactria, were less about sightseeing and more about scouting trade opportunities. Think of him as the ancient world's LinkedIn influencer, connecting the dots between East and West, albeit with more camels and fewer hashtags. And what was on the trading menu? A smorgasbord of goodies that would make any ancient entrepreneur drool. Silk, of course, was the headliner. This wasn't just any fabric. It was the luxury good par excellence, fetching eye-watering prices in Rome. We're talking about a commodity so coveted that it was practically currency. But it wasn't all about silk. Spices, precious stones, ivory, and everything in between made their way along these routes. And let's not forget the cultural exchange, ideas, religions, and technologies hitchhiked along in traders' packs, changing the world in ways no one could have predicted. The economic motives behind this early form of globalization were as varied as the goods themselves. For the Han and other players, it was all about securing the exotic commodities that couldn't be found in the local market. The Chinese were particularly fond of Fergana's heavenly horses, believing them to be the key to military superiority. Meanwhile, the Romans had a taste for silk that bordered on obsession, despite the Senate's grumblings about the moral decay it supposedly heralded. Ah, the joys of ancient moral panics. But let's not romanticize too much. The Silk Road wasn't all silks and spices. It was a perilous enterprise. Traders faced bandits, treacherous terrain, and the odd political upheaval. Not to mention the logistical nightmare of transporting goods across such vast distances. Imagine carting bolts of silk across the Taklamakan Desert, a place whose name literally means, go in and you won't come out, with nothing but camels, determination, and maybe a questionable map. The reality was a far cry from the glamorous image we might have of exotic caravans. So, why does all this matter? Because the Silk Road was like the ancient world's internet, a network that connected far-flung regions in a web of commerce, culture, and communication. It was globalization before globalization was cool, setting the stage for the interconnected world we live in today. And it all started with the Han Dynasty's ambition to reach beyond its borders, proving that sometimes the best way to get what you want is to strike a deal, or several hundred of them. In the next leg of this journey, we'll delve deeper into the myriad cultures and civilizations that hopped on this trading bandwagon, each adding their own spice to the Silk Road stew. But for now, keep in mind that this legendary trade network was less about a single road and more about a chaotic, vibrant web, a bit like the internet, only with more camels and fewer cat memes. Speaking of camels and cat memes, let's take a moment to appreciate the logistical circus that was the Silk Road journey. Picture carving a path through a 4,000-mile expanse, just you, your trusty caravan, and a desert that sounds like a death threat. From Xi'an to the Mediterranean, merchants faced challenges that would make modern shipping delays look like a stroll through a well-stocked supermarket. We're talking about a trek where losing a camel to exhaustion was as common as losing a sock in the dryer. But hey, at least no one had to deal with online reviews. Let's start with our four-legged friends, the camels. These beasts of burden were the unsung heroes of the Silk Road, but they weren't exactly the smooth rides you might hope for. Imagine a road trip where your car occasionally decides to lie down and refuse to move. Camels had a knack for doing just that, particularly in the unforgiving climates they traversed. The Taklamakan Desert, for instance, was a notorious camel graveyard, with its scorching days, freezing nights, and sandstorms that could exfoliate the skin right off your bones. It was the Silk Road's personal version of Dante's Inferno. Now, if you think those tropical beach vacations get hot, try a summer day in the Gobi Desert. Temperatures could hit a toasty 122 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of heat that makes you question all life choices. But camels weren't the only challenge. Enter bandits, the original highway robbers with a penchant for silk and spices. These guys were the reason why traders often travelled in convoys, safety in numbers being the ancient world's best insurance policy. You never knew when a bandit gang might appear on the horizon, ready to relieve you of your precious cargo. It was a real-life game of keep your goods or lose your life, and not everyone made it through with their inventory intact. But hey, who doesn't love a little high-stakes drama on a road trip? Speaking of drama, let's not forget the political chess games that could turn your journey into a geopolitical minefield. With so many empires, kingdoms, and tribes staking their claim along the Silk Road, traders had to navigate more than just physical obstacles. One day, you might find yourself paying a toll to a friendly local warlord, and the next, dodging arrows from a rival chieftain who didn't get the memo about your peaceful intentions. It was like playing Risk, only with actual risks and no bathroom breaks. And let's not even start on the language barriers. Imagine negotiating a trade deal using charades while trying not to insult anyone's mother. Now, let's talk about those caravans. When we say caravan, don't picture a sleek line of well-organized camels. Think more along the lines of a chaotic parade, with merchants, animals and goods jumbled together in a moving market. These caravans could range from a handful of camels to hundreds, depending on the wealth and ambition of the trader. And the costs? Oh boy. Hiring an entire caravan could set you back the equivalent of thousands of today's dollars, not to mention the expenses of feeding and watering both man and beast along the way. It was a financial gamble that could make or break a fortune. And just when you thought it couldn't get any more complicated, let's throw in some environmental hurdles. The Silk Road was a masterclass in extreme climates, from the bone-dry deserts to the snow-capped mountains of the Tian Shan Range. Crossing these peaks required nerves of steel and a tolerance for the kind of cold that could freeze the words right out of your mouth. Between avalanches and altitude sickness, it was less conquering the mountain and more surviving the ordeal. Despite all this chaos, there was something undeniably romantic about the Silk Road's allure. The idea of distant lands, exotic goods, and the promise of riches drew traders like moths to a flame. But the reality? It was more of a gritty, exhausting slog than an adventure novel. Still, the dream of what lay at the end of the road kept them going, silks, spices, and stories to tell. In the end, the Silk Road was less about the journey and more about the destination, or rather, the destinations. It connected a web of cities, each a cultural melting pot where East met West in a vibrant exchange of goods and ideas. From the bustling bazaars of Samarkand to the ancient markets of Aleppo, these cities were the true heart of the Silk Road. But that's a story for another day. For now, let's remember the traders who braved the odds, risking life and limb for a chance at fortune. They were the unsung entrepreneurs of the ancient world, navigating a perilous path with nothing but determination and a little bit of luck. And who knows, maybe they even had a sense of humour about it all? After all, if you can't laugh at a camel breakdown, what can you laugh at? As we continue this journey, we'll dive into the vibrant cultures that made the Silk Road a living tapestry of human history. But hold that thought, because there's plenty more to uncover about this legendary trade network. As we weave our way along the Silk Road, it's time to dive into the cultural cocktail that this trade network shook up, where religions like Buddhism and Islam weren't just hitching a ride, they were basically holding a masterclass in cultural exchange. Imagine the Silk Road as a kind of ancient TED Talk circuit, with monks and missionaries as the keynote speakers. Now, before we get all misty-eyed about this kumbaya moment of cultural mingling, let's stir the pot a bit and look at the spicy reality behind the romance. First up on our Silk Road itinerary is Buddhism, which made its way from India to China like a philosophical freight train. We're talking about a massive cultural import that didn't just nibble at the edges of Chinese society, It sank its teeth in and left a mark deeper than a trader's camel tracks across the Taklamakan. The spread of Buddhism along the Silk Road was a game-changer. Imagine an empire of thought stretching all the way from the Indian subcontinent to the heart of China. It wasn't just a religion, it was an entire cultural package. From art and architecture to literature and ethics, Buddhism seeped into the very fabric of life along the way. Buddhist monks were the original globetrotters, and they didn't travel light. They lugged around not just scriptures, but entire philosophies, often in the form of Sanskrit texts. And if you think the logistics of trading silk were tough, try hauling a library across deserts and mountains. Yet, these monks were the real MVPs of cultural exchange. Around the 1st century CE, they began translating these texts into Chinese, leading to a cultural renaissance that could make the Italian one look like a neighborhood bake sale. By the time the Tang dynasty rolled in, around the 7th century CE, Buddhism had become as Chinese as rice and tea. But let's not get too carried away with this vision of peaceful pilgrimage. The reality was more complicated. As Buddhism spread, it faced its share of pushback. Picture a cultural tug-of-war, with Confucian scholars and Taoists pulling from one end, suspicious of this foreign import taking root in Chinese soil. Occasionally, this philosophical friction blew up into full-on persecutions, like the infamous great anti-Buddhist persecution of the Tang dynasty in 845 CE, where thousands of monasteries were destroyed and monks were forced to return to lay life. It was less about spiritual enlightenment and more about political power plays. And then there's Islam, which entered the Silk Road scene a bit later, but left an indelible mark. After the death of Prophet Muhammad in 632 CE, Islam spread rapidly across the Arabian Peninsula, and by the 8th century it was making waves along the Silk Road. Traders, soldiers and missionaries didn't just bring spices and silk, they brought the Quran and a new way of life. Islam's arrival was a cultural revolution, particularly in Central Asia. Cities like Samarkand and Bukhara became hubs of Islamic learning and culture, where scholars and scientists rubbed shoulders with traders and artists. But while Islam brought a rich tapestry of art, science and philosophy, it also came with its own set of tensions. For instance, the arrival of Islam in Central Asia wasn't a gentle introduction. It often came riding on the back of military conquest, like the Umayyad Caliphate's expansion into Sind around 711 CE, which was less of a friendly neighborhood welcome and more of a join or else scenario. The spread of Islam often involved a complex mix of diplomacy, trade partnerships, and sometimes, let's face it, good old-fashioned force. This wasn't just a peaceful exchange of ideas over some spiced tea. The Silk Road was a cultural battleground where religions competed for hearts, minds, and souls. But that's not to say it was all swords and sermons. In many cases, these interactions led to syncretism, a fancy term for cultural mashups. Take the blending of Buddhist and Islamic art, for instance, which resulted in beautiful, unique styles that still make art historians swoon, or the fusion of Persian, Indian and Chinese influences in the architecture of Central Asia's mosques and monasteries. And let's not forget the political chessboard on which these cultural exchanges were playing out. The Silk Road wasn't just a straight shot from A to B. It was a tangle of different empires and kingdoms, each with its own agenda. The Tang dynasty, the Abbasid Caliphate, the Sasanian Empire. They all had their fingers in the Silk Road pie, and they weren't always playing nice. These were powerhouses with serious geopolitical clout, and their interactions were as much about strategic alliances and rivalries as they were about trading goods or ideas. As we reflect on this complex web of exchange, it's tempting to imagine the Silk Road as an idyllic melting pot of cultures, where everyone held hands and sang songs of unity. But the truth is messier and far more intriguing. It was a place where cultures collided, clashed, and occasionally coalesced into something new and unexpected. The Silk Road was a testament to the human spirit's drive to connect, learn, and sometimes just survive in a world full of obstacles and opportunities. So, as we wrap up this leg of our Silk Road journey, remember that the trade network was more than just a highway of goods. It was a superhighway of ideas, beliefs, and ambitions. It was the original global village, where East met West in a grand, chaotic, and sometimes contentious exchange that shaped the world as we know it. And as we continue to unravel this fascinating tapestry, there's plenty more to explore, so stay tuned. because the Silk Road story is far from over. The Silk Road wasn't just a meandering path of merchants and camels, it was a battlefield of empires, each vying to control the trade routes like a game of Monopoly with real stakes. Think silk instead of hotels, and bandits instead of unlucky chance cards. And if you're picturing these empires as genteel gentlemen shaking hands over a cup of tea, think again. We're talking about gritty, no-holds-barred power plays where economic dominance was the ultimate prize. First up, the Roman Empire. Now, the Romans had a reputation for indulging in the finer things in life, and silk was no exception. By the 1st century BCE, silk had become the toga of choice for the Roman elite, despite the Senate's stern warnings about its morally suspect allure. Silk's sinuous grip on Roman society was so strong that by 301 CE, Diocletian had to issue an edict on maximum prices, attempting to regulate the slippery fabric's impact on the Roman economy. But let's face it, the Romans were hooked, and they weren't about to let a little thing like economic stability get in the way of their fashion obsessions. Economically, the Silk Road was a lifeline for the Roman Empire, offering access to luxury goods that were otherwise unattainable. But, as always, there was a catch. Rome's insatiable appetite for silk created a trade imbalance that was as lopsided as a seesaw with an elephant on one end. Gold and silver flowed eastward in exchange for silk, a dynamic that didn't exactly make Rome's accountants sleep easy. As the empire's coffers drained, the economic strain contributed to the pressures that would eventually help topple this ancient powerhouse. The irony? Rome's lust for luxury played a part in its fall, a silk-clad Achilles' heel, if you will. As the Roman Empire waned, the Byzantine Empire picked up the baton, or rather, the silk thread. The Byzantines, with Constantinople as their glittering capital, knew that controlling silk meant controlling both fashion and fortune. So, in a classic Byzantine maneuver, they decided to cut out the middlemen, literally. In the 6th century, Emperor Justinian I pulled off an espionage coup worthy of a spy novel. He sent 2 monks to China, not on a pilgrimage, but on a silk-stealing mission. These monks weren't carrying sacred texts, they were smuggling silkworm eggs and mulberry seeds back to Byzantium in their hollowed-out walking staffs. Talk about divine intervention. This act of industrial espionage shifted the silk production game, allowing the Byzantines to start producing their own silk and reducing their dependence on Chinese imports. Economically, this was a masterstroke. It not only secured Byzantium's place as a key player in the silk trade, but also helped fill the imperial treasury. Politically, it was a move that reinforced Byzantium's status as the heir to Rome's legacy, complete with the silk-draped trappings of empire. But the Byzantine Empire wasn't the only contender in the Silk Road's Game of Thrones. Enter the Mongol Empire, a force so formidable that it makes Game of Thrones' dragons look like lapdogs. By the 13th century, the Mongols had carved out an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe, a swath of territory so vast it makes Roman ambitions look like a backyard BBQ. Under the leadership of Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongols didn't just control the Silk Road, they turbocharged it. The Mongols were the Silk Road's unlikely champions, fostering trade like no empire before. They established the Pax Mongolica, a period of relative peace and stability across their empire which allowed trade to flourish. Think of it as the Mongol version of Amazon Prime. Trade routes became faster, safer, and more efficient. Merchants, no longer at the mercy of bandits or petty warlords, could ply their trade across thousands of miles, knowing that Mongol law and Mongol soldiers had their backs. This was globalization on horseback, with Genghis Khan as the trailblazer. Yet, it's worth noting that the Mongols weren't exactly known for their gentle touch. Their empire was built on conquest, and their methods were as brutal as they were effective. Cities that resisted faced destruction, while those that capitulated could enjoy the benefits of being part of the world's largest free trade zone, albeit with the constant reminder that dissent was not an option. The Mongols' iron grip ensured that the Silk Road's arteries ran wide open, pumping goods, ideas, and, yes, even the Black Death, across continents with unprecedented speed. The Mongol Empire's approach to the Silk Road was pragmatic, leveraging their military might to create an economic juggernaut. But it was also a double-edged sword. The same roads that carried traders also carried armies, and the empire's vastness meant that it was as vulnerable as it was formidable. Like a sandcastle at high tide, the Mongol Empire's unity eventually crumbled, fragmented by internal strife and the sheer difficulty of managing such a sprawling domain. The irony? The very interconnectedness that fueled their success also sowed the seeds of their downfall. In this grand game of Silk Road monopoly, each empire had its moment in the sun, only to be replaced by the next ambitious contender. The Roman, Byzantine, and Mongol empires each left indelible marks on the Silk Road, shaping the flow of goods and ideas in ways that resonate even today. But while their ambitions were vast, their control was never absolute. The Silk Road was a living entity, a tapestry woven by countless hands, each thread representing a culture, a transaction, a journey. And as we ponder these empires' attempts to dominate the trade routes, it's clear that the Silk Road was as much about human resilience and adaptability as it was about imperial grandstanding. The real story is one of traders and travellers, of cultural exchanges and unexpected alliances, all set against the backdrop of shifting political landscapes. So, as we continue our journey along this storied path, let's keep our eyes on the horizon. There's more to uncover, more stories to tell, and more myths to unravel. After all, the Silk Road's tale is far from finished, and the road ahead is as intriguing as the one we've travelled. As we stand on the cusp of the Silk Road's twilight years, let's take a moment to appreciate the shifting tides of history that signalled the end of this ancient superhighway. By the 15th century, the Silk Road was like an aging rock star, legendary but struggling to keep up with the fresher, faster competition. The competition in question? Sea routes. Imagine Vasco da Gama and his seafaring pals as the new kids on the block, sailing in with a swagger that left the old land routes in their wake. The decline of the Silk Road wasn't an overnight affair. It was more of a slow fade, like a curtain gently falling on an epic play. The Mongol Empire's disintegration in the 14th century set the stage for chaos. Political instability made overland travel perilous, and trade began to dwindle. Meanwhile, technological advances in navigation were turning the oceans into the new Silk Road. Only this one was waterborne and, let's face it, a lot less sandy. The Portuguese, with their maritime innovations, were the trailblazers. In 1498, Vasco da Gama's successful voyage to India opened a sea route that promised spices and silks without the hassle of bandits or the need to bribe every petty warlord from Xi'an to Constantinople. Suddenly, the world was smaller, and the Silk Road's logistical circus seemed less appealing. A ship could carry more goods faster than an entire caravan, making maritime trade the new darling of global commerce. Economically, this shift was monumental. Sea routes allowed for the bulk transportation of goods, lowering costs and increasing profits. The likes of the East India Company weren't just trading companies, they were economic juggernauts, paving the way for the global capitalism we know today. The Silk Road, once the lifeline of empires, was being outpaced by the demands of a rapidly globalizing economy. Yet, while the Silk Road's decline might sound like a tragic end, its legacy is far from lost. This ancient trade network laid the groundwork for the interconnected world we inhabit. It was the granddaddy of globalization, where ideas and innovations travelled alongside silks and spices, leaving an indelible mark on history. The spread of religions, technologies, and even the Black Death, all thanks to the Silk Road's arteries, reminds us that this wasn't just a route for goods, but a conduit for change. Let's not forget the mythic allure that still captivates our imaginations today. The Silk Road is often romanticized as a grand adventure, and for good reason. Its tales of exotic lands and daring merchants are the stuff of legend. But let's be real, the reality was more grueling trek than glamorous tour. Those who braved the road weren't just chasing riches, they were surviving a gauntlet of harsh terrains and political chess games. Yet, it's precisely this blend of romance and reality that keeps the Silk Road's legacy alive. In today's world, the Silk Road spirit lives on in our digital age. The Internet, with its vast network connecting people across the globe, is the modern Silk Road, only with less dust and more memes. The same drive to connect, trade, and exchange ideas persists, albeit at the speed of light rather than the pace of a plodding camel. It's a testament to humanity's enduring quest for connection and understanding. So, As we close this chapter on the Silk Road, let's not just view it as a relic of the past. Instead, see it as a foundation for our present and a bridge to our future. It was a path that wove together the threads of countless cultures, creating a tapestry of human history that continues to influence us today. From the spices in your kitchen to the philosophies that shape our worldviews, the Silk Road's legacy is woven into the very fabric of our lives. And remember, while the Silk Road may no longer be traversed by caravans, its spirit of exploration and exchange remains timeless. It's a reminder that, even in a world that feels increasingly divided, the desire to connect and learn from one another is a thread that binds us all. So, as you drift off to sleep with visions of camels and caravans, know that the Silk Road's journey is far from over. It's merely taken on a new form, echoing through the corridors of time and into the digital age. In the beginning, there was chaos, or as Mesopotamians might have called it, another Tuesday. Welcome to the land between the rivers, the ancient stomping ground where civilization took its first baby steps and promptly tripped over its own enthusiasm. Mesopotamia, nestled snugly between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, was the kind of place where inventing the wheel was just another weekend project. Before brunch. This was the Fertile Crescent, a seductive strip of land that had history's movers and shakers drooling over its rich, arable soil. Why? Because in a world where your next meal depended on what you could coax out of the ground, Mesopotamia was the equivalent of prime Manhattan real estate. Now, when we talk about Mesopotamia, we're not just talking about one civilization. Oh no, this was a revolving door of power players, Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, all vying for that precious land like reality show contestants fighting over the last rose. Each had their moment in the spotlight, and each left their mark in ways ranging from brilliant to bonkers. It's no wonder that historians have often romanticized this region as the cradle of civilization, a serene birthplace of writing, agriculture, and urban living. But let's not kid ourselves. This was no peaceful utopia. It was more like a chaotic family reunion with a side of sibling rivalry. One thing that's undeniable about Mesopotamia is its geographical luck. The Tigris and Euphrates, flowing down from the mountains of Anatolia, cradled this region with their life-giving waters. But before you start envisioning a peaceful riverside picnic, remember that these rivers had a mind of their own. They were prone to unpredictable flooding, turning fields into swamps faster than you could say irrigation. Yet, this very unpredictability is what made the land so fertile. The rivers deposited nutrient-rich silt over the plains, allowing crops like barley and wheat to thrive. Cue the world's first farmers, who figured out that if you dug a few canals and prayed hard enough, you might just feed a city. But let's talk numbers for a second. Around 3000 BCE, Uruk, one of the earliest cities, boasted a population of around 50,000. That's like cramming the entire city of San Marino into one dusty, bustling metropolis. Not too shabby for a place with no plumbing. These cities weren't just large, they were organized. Mesopotamians invented cuneiform writing, which was basically an accountant's dream come true. They kept records on everything from grain supplies to trade transactions, turning clay tablets into the world's first spreadsheets. And thus, bureaucracy was born, a true gift to humanity. Now, why did everyone in their chariot want a piece of this land? The answer is simple: resources. Mesopotamia was a literal breadbasket, and its abundance made it a prime target for conquest. But here's the kicker. While the land was fertile, it was also resource poor in other ways. Wood, metal, and stone were about as common as unicorns. This led to a thriving trade network stretching from Anatolia to the Indus Valley. Trade brought in goods and ideas, but it also brought conflict. After all, when everyone's chasing the same finite resources, it's only a matter of time before someone throws the first spear. The notion of Mesopotamia as a harmonious cradle of civilization is a bit of a historical fairy tale. Sure, they gave us writing and the wheel, but they also gave us the first recorded wars. The Sumerians and Akkadians, for instance, were like that couple who just couldn't stop breaking up and getting back together, except with more casualties and less romantic reconciliation. Around 2334 BCE, Sargon of Akkad established one of the world's first empires, uniting various city-states under his rule. But even his empire was a temporary affair, crumbling under the weight of rebellion and invasion like a sandcastle at high tide. To call Mesopotamia a land of contrasts would be an understatement. For every breakthrough in governance and culture, there was a counterpoint of conflict and chaos. This wasn't a static world. It was a dynamic, ever-changing landscape where power was as fleeting as the last floodwaters of spring. So, while it's tempting to romanticize Mesopotamia as a peaceful birthplace of civilization, the reality is a bit grittier. It was a place of innovation and upheaval, of brilliant minds and brutal rulers. The cradle of civilization? Sure. But also a cradle of conflict, where the seeds of human progress were watered with equal parts ingenuity and strife. In the grand scheme of history, Mesopotamia was like the opening act of a rock concert, setting the stage for everything that followed. It was loud, chaotic, and a little bit unpredictable, but it left an indelible mark on the world. And, as we delve deeper into its stories, we'll find that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Because if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that humans have always been, well, human. And that's both a blessing and a curse. Now, let's wade into the muddy waters of Mesopotamian politics, where alliances were as stable as a Jenga tower in the middle of an earthquake. This was a world where city-states popped up like mushrooms after a rainstorm, each with its own king, council, and a penchant for squabbling. These weren't your run-of-the-mill cities. They were the first urban jungles, places like Uruk, and Lagash, each vying for supremacy in a cutthroat game of geopolitical chess. Picture this. By 3000 BCE, these cities were already bustling metropolises, with Uruk alone boasting a population of around 50,000. That's more than enough to form a decent-sized mob if the king's latest tax policy didn't go down well at the local tavern. Speaking of kings, let's talk about the big man on the ziggurat, Gilgamesh. Now, Gilgamesh was the king of Uruk, and if you believe the epic tales, he was 2/3 god, 1/3 human, a genetic feat that would make even the most ambitious geneticist raise an eyebrow. But, despite the divine family tree, Gilgamesh was far from a celestial paragon. Imagine a boss who thought mandatory overtime was a fun team-building exercise. Yep, that's Gilgamesh for you. He was infamous for his tyrannical reign, a ruler whose idea of governance involved flexing his muscles and occasionally dabbling in epic quests. Not exactly management material, but hey, it made for great storytelling. The Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the oldest known pieces of literature, a tale that predates even the Iliad. It's a heady mix of adventure, bromance, and existential musings, with a dash of monster slaying for good measure. But let's not get swept away by the poetry. The story paints Gilgamesh as a hero, a larger-than-life figure who embarks on a quest for immortality. In reality, he was probably more of a Bronze Age CEO who struggled with public relations. The epic tells us about Gilgamesh's friendship with Enkidu, a wild man created by the gods to curb his excesses. Their bromance was the stuff of legends, but historical evidence suggests that Gilgamesh's relationships were more about power dynamics than heartwarming camaraderie. Now, let's shift gears to the nitty-gritty of Mesopotamian society. At the heart of it all was a complex social hierarchy that would make even a Game of Thrones family tree look straightforward. At the top were the kings and priests, living in opulence, while at the bottom were the slaves, the backbone of the economy. In between, you had merchants, artisans and farmers, each contributing to the economic engine that kept the city-states running. And speaking of engines, let's not forget the unsung hero of Mesopotamian innovation, cuneiform writing. Cuneiform was the world's first writing system, developed by the Sumerians around 3200 BCE. Picture this: accountants with clay tablets, scribbling away with a stylus, creating the world's earliest spreadsheets. This wasn't just about recording history, it was about bureaucracy. Cuneiform allowed for the meticulous recording of transactions, laws and treaties. It was the original paper trail, ensuring that no grain of barley went unaccounted for. This wasn't just a technological leap, it was the dawn of red tape, a triumph of organization over chaos. But why all the fuss over record-keeping? Enter the world of trade and economy, where silver shekels were the currency of choice, long before Bitcoin was a twinkle in a techie's eye. Mesopotamia was a hub of commerce, a bustling marketplace where goods and ideas flowed like the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates. Silver wasn't just a shiny metal. It was the lifeblood of trade, a standardized currency that facilitated transactions across the region. By 2500 BCE, silver was the lingua franca of trade, a universal standard that enabled merchants to haggle over everything from textiles to tin. Trade was the glue that held Mesopotamian society together, creating networks that stretched from Anatolia to the Indus Valley. It wasn't just about goods, it was about cultural exchange, the transmission of ideas and technologies that propelled civilizations forward. But here's the kicker. While trade brought prosperity, it also sowed the seeds of conflict. The more valuable the trade routes, the more tempting they were for rival city-states and opportunistic invaders. It was a high-stakes game of risk and reward, a delicate balancing act that could tip into chaos at any moment. The Mesopotamian economy wasn't just a local affair, it was an intricate web of interconnections, a precursor to the globalized world we know today. And like any complex system, it was vulnerable to shocks. Droughts, floods, and invasions could disrupt the delicate balance, sending ripples of instability through the region. It was a world where the only constant was change, where adaptability was the key to survival. So, as we delve deeper into the saga of ancient Mesopotamia, let's remember that this was a land of contradictions. It was a place where the seeds of civilization were sown in the fertile soil of conflict and cooperation. A place where legendary figures like Gilgamesh strode across the stage of history, leaving footprints that still echo through the ages. It was a world where the wheels of trade and bureaucracy turned ceaselessly, driven by the relentless pursuit of progress and prosperity. And as we continue to explore this fascinating chapter of human history, we'll uncover more of the myths and realities that shaped the cradle of civilization. Because in the end, history is a tapestry woven from the threads of both legend and fact, a story as rich and complex as the land between the rivers itself. As we turn the page to the next chapter of Mesopotamian life, let's dive into a world where divine intervention was just another Tuesday and gods were as ubiquitous as cat memes on the internet. Yes, the Mesopotamians had a deity for everything: love, war, agriculture, the weather, you name it. If you could think of it, they had a god for it. Their pantheon was more crowded than a New York subway at rush hour and just as unpredictable. Now, before you start thinking these gods were lounging around in heavenly gardens all day, sipping divine ambrosia, let's set the record straight. Mesopotamian gods were demanding. They expected regular worship and, more importantly, offerings. We're talking about sacrifices, feasts, and rituals that could make or break a city's fortunes. For the Mesopotamians, religion wasn't just a Sunday affair, it was woven into the very fabric of daily life, like the threads of a particularly complicated and expensive rug. And who ran the show in this divine sitcom? The priests, of course. These were the original multitaskers, acting as intermediaries between the mortal and the divine, all while keeping the temple's books balanced. Priests in Mesopotamia were essentially ancient accountants in fancy robes, managing temple economies that rivaled small nations. They oversaw the collection of offerings, organized festivals, and made sure the gods were appeased, because an unhappy god was as welcome as a tax audit. Speaking of temple economics, let's talk numbers. In a city like the temple complex could control vast swaths of land, employing thousands of people. We're talking about an economic powerhouse, with temples owning up to a third of the arable land. The temple wasn't just a place of worship, it was a hub of economic activity. Priests managed everything from agricultural production to trade, turning the temple into the beating heart of the city's economy. Forget Wall Street. This was the real financial district. Now, onto the architecture of divine appeasement, the ziggurat. These weren't just buildings, they were the skyscrapers of the ancient world. Each ziggurat was a massive, tiered structure, reaching up to the heavens like a Sumerian skyscraper, with dreams of touching the sky. Picture it, a towering monument, built with sun-dried bricks and adorned with the finest craftsmanship of the time. The ziggurat at for example, stood about 100 feet tall, a veritable giant in a landscape of mud brick houses. But why go to all this effort? Well, in a world where the favour of the gods could mean the difference between flood and famine, you wanted them to have the best seat in the house. Ziggurats were designed to bring the gods closer to the people, offering them prime real estate views of the cities they presided over. It was the ancient equivalent of a penthouse suite, complete with divine room service. The myths surrounding these gods could be as complex as the taxes they demanded. Take the story of Inanna, the goddess of love and war. Her tales are filled with intrigue, passion, and more drama than a soap opera marathon. In one story, Inanna descends into the underworld, only to be stripped of her power and possessions. It's a tale of vulnerability and resurrection, a narrative that resonated with a people who lived at the mercy of the elements. But let's not get swept away by the romance of it all. While these myths provided meaning and structure, they were also tools of power. They reinforced the social hierarchy, legitimizing the rule of kings and priests alike. After all, if the gods were in charge, then their earthly representatives must be as well. It's a classic case of divine right, one that's been echoed through history by rulers from pharaohs to kings. Now, it's easy to romanticize these ancient beliefs, to see them as quaint relics of a bygone era. But the reality was far grittier. Religion in Mesopotamia was a serious business, one that could dictate the whims of politics and the economy. It was a world where faith and finance were inextricably linked, where the temples were not just spiritual centers, but economic powerhouses. As we peel back the layers of Mesopotamian spirituality, we find a society that was as complex as it was devout. It was a world where gods walked among men, where temples were the beating heart of the city, and where the line between the sacred and the secular was as blurred as a watercolor painting in the rain. And as we continue this journey through Mesopotamian history, we'll uncover more of the myths and realities that shaped the cradle of civilization. So, as we leave behind the celestial heights of the ziggurats and the labyrinthine corridors of temple economics, let's not forget the lessons of this ancient world. Because while the gods of Mesopotamia may have faded into the annals of history, their stories remain, echoing through the ages like the distant rumble of thunder in a summer sky. After all, history has a way of repeating itself, and the more things change, the more they stay the same. As we delve deeper into the labyrinth of Mesopotamian society, we'll find that the past is never truly past. It's just waiting to be rediscovered. So, as we leave behind the celestial heights of the ziggurats and the labyrinthine corridors of temple economics, let's dive into the down-to-earth realities of Mesopotamian life. The stuff that didn't make it into the epic poetry. Because while Gilgamesh was busy wrestling with existential questions and mythical beasts, the average Mesopotamian was grappling with more mundane adversaries, like figuring out how to write their grocery lists in cuneiform. First up, let's toast to one of humanity's greatest contributions to civilization, beer. Ah yes, the nectar of the gods, or at least the Sumerians. Around 3000 BCE, these early innovators were already brewing up a storm, proving that even ancient folks knew the value of a good pint after a long day of wrangling irrigation canals. This was no small beer. It was a staple of the Mesopotamian diet, considered safer to drink than the often questionable water supplies. They even had a goddess of beer, Ninkasi, whose hymn doubles as one of the earliest known recipes. And while today's craft beer aficionados might debate the merits of a double IPA, back then beer was thick, unfiltered, and served with a straw to bypass the floating chaff. Cheers to progress. But let's not get too carried away by the romantic notion that ancient life was all beer and skittles. The reality was a bit more gritty. Take the legal codes, for example. You think modern legal jargon is tough? Try deciphering the Code of Hammurabi, a collection of 282 laws etched onto a diorite stele around 1754 BCE. This was the ancient equivalent of terms and conditions, but with a bit more bite. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Hammurabi's laws didn't mess around. They regulated everything from property rights to family law, with punishments that would make today's lawyers cringe. It was justice by the numbers, and not always a fair game for the lower classes. Speaking of inequality, let's shine a spotlight on the concept of enlightened despotism. Now, the phrase itself suggests a ruler who's benevolent, wise, and just. But in Mesopotamia, the reality was more like despotism with a PR. Team. Kings like Hammurabi and Sargon of Akkad might have fancied themselves as divinely appointed shepherds of their people, but their rule was often more about consolidation of power than community outreach. Rulers claimed divine sanction to justify their authority, but the average citizen was less concerned with celestial mandates and more with earthly matters like avoiding the lash for missing taxes. And what about the daily grind of Mesopotamian life? Forget the glamorous tales of heroism and gods meddling in human affairs. The real story was about hard work under a relentless sun. The average Mesopotamian was likely a farmer, toiling away in the fields from dawn till dusk, all in the quest to coax a decent harvest from the temperamental soil. With irrigation came the endless upkeep of canals, and while the resulting abundance was the backbone of their booming cities, it was also a back-breaking endeavour. Let's not skip over the urbanites either. In cities like Uruk and Ur, life was a constant hustle. Merchants haggled in markets that buzzed like a beehive. Artisans crafted goods that ranged from practical to luxurious, and somewhere in the background scribes were busy chipping away at clay tablets, recording transactions with the precision of a modern-day CPA. And while literacy was a treasured skill for most, the written word was as mysterious as the nightly constellations. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, the allure of those epic tales. It's tempting to see the myths and legends as reflections of everyday life, but for the average Mesopotamian, the world of heroes and gods was a distant echo. Sure, they might have gathered around to hear tales of Gilgamesh's exploits, but the pressing concerns were far more terrestrial, like the next harvest or the price of barley. Mesopotamia's epic narratives were as much escapism as they were cultural artifacts, serving as a reminder that even ancient societies needed a break from reality. In essence, Mesopotamia was a land of contrasts, a place where the extraordinary was built on the shoulders of the ordinary. It was a world where innovation thrived alongside tradition, where the seeds of civilization were nurtured by both ambition and necessity. And while it's easy to get lost in the romantic allure of ancient myths, the real story lies in the daily lives of those who built the foundations of history, one mud brick at a time. As we continue to unearth the stories of ancient Mesopotamia, let's remember that, much like today, it was a place of both dreams and drudgery. The past, as it turns out, is not so different from the present. So, as we prepare to dive deeper into the next chapter of this ancient saga, let's keep our eyes open to both the myths and the realities, because history, much like a well-brewed beer, is best savoured with a healthy dose of curiosity and a pinch of skepticism. Stay tuned, because the best stories are yet to be told. And as we prepare to dive deeper into the next chapter of this ancient saga, let's keep our eyes open to both the myths and the realities, because history, much like a well-brewed beer, is best savoured with a healthy dose of curiosity and a pinch of skepticism. Stay tuned, because the best stories are yet to be told. Ah, Mesopotamia, we've seen it rise from the muddy depths of the Fertile Crescent, blossom into a bustling hub of culture and innovation, and now, like all good things, it must face the bittersweet symphony of decline. But before we start humming mournful tunes, let's unpack how this powerhouse of civilization met its eventual doom, and left behind a legacy more enduring than a celebrity's 15 minutes of fame. The decline of Mesopotamian civilizations is like a masterclass in historical irony. You'd think that a region dubbed the cradle of civilization would have lasted longer than a season of a reality TV show. But alas, the sands of time wait for no empire. Mesopotamia faced a trifecta of woes, invasions, climate change, and internal strife, making it clear that even the mightiest can be brought low by forces beyond their control or by their own stubborn short-sightedness. Let's start with climate change, a villain that's been around longer than your least favourite politician. Around the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, the climate decided to switch things up with a dry spell that would have left even the most optimistic farmer shaking his head. The once bountiful rivers became erratic, their life-giving waters dwindling faster than a New Year's resolution at the gym. Crops failed, and with them the stability of city-states that depended on agriculture to fuel their economies. Suddenly, the fertile lands were less like prime real estate and more like a desert vacation with no return ticket. But wait, there's more. As if nature's wrath wasn't enough, internal strife played its part in unravelling the Mesopotamian tapestry. Imagine trying to run a tight ship when everyone's more interested in staging a coup than in steering the course. City-states, once united under the banner of empires like that of Hammurabi or the Assyrians, found themselves embroiled in endless power struggles. Kings came and went with the regularity of a soap opera's cast changes, each one promising stability and delivering chaos, kind of like ordering a salad and getting a burger. And then there were the invasions. Ah yes, the historic equivalent of an uninvited guest who just won't leave. The Babylonians, Assyrians, and other Mesopotamian heavyweights faced relentless incursions by various groups, including the infamous Sea Peoples. These invaders swept in from the peripheries like a storm, eager to carve out their own piece of the Mesopotamian pie. By the first millennium BCE, the once mighty Assyrians were toppled by the Medes and the Babylonians, and not long after, the Persians swept in to plant their flag. It was like a game of musical chairs, but with more bloodshed and fewer rules. Yet, despite the tumult and eventual decline, the legacy of Mesopotamia is far from a forgotten relic buried in the sands. This ancient civilization left behind innovations that continue to shape our world today. Take the idea of written laws, for example. Hammurabi's code may have been harsh, but it laid the groundwork for the legal systems that govern our lives today. Next time you're grumbling about jury duty, remember that you're partaking in a tradition that dates back to those ancient lawgivers who decided that disputes should be settled with a bit more decorum than a fistfight. Urban planning, too, owes a debt to Mesopotamia. These early architects designed cities with structured grids, temples, and public spaces that served as blueprints for future urban development. It's the ancestor of modern city planning, minus the skyscrapers and traffic jams. The wheel, a quintessential Mesopotamian invention, revolutionized transport and is still turning today, albeit with a few upgrades and a more robust suspension system. And who could forget the cuneiform writing system? Though you might not be taking notes in cuneiform these days, this early form of writing paved the way for recorded history, literature, and the joy of deciphering ancient texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh. It was the original data storage, ensuring that the exploits of kings and the accounts of their kingdoms could be passed down through the ages. Even the concept of time owes a nod to Mesopotamia. These ancient timekeepers divided the day into 24 hours, and the circle into 360 degrees, a cosmic insight that continues to tick by on our clocks and guide our navigation systems. It's a testament to Mesopotamian ingenuity that their ideas have lasted longer than the empires that spawned them. So, what's the takeaway from the saga of Mesopotamia? It's a lesson in resilience, innovation, and the bittersweet reality that nothing lasts forever. The empires that rose and fell in the land between the rivers are reminders that human civilization is as much about overcoming adversity as it is about basking in glory. The Mesopotamians might not have foreseen the modern world, but they certainly laid the groundwork for it, brick by sun-dried brick. As we wrap up our journey through Mesopotamia's history, let's raise a glass or a clay cup, if you're feeling authentic, to the land that taught us the value of writing things down, the importance of urban planning, and the inevitability of change. The cradle of civilization may have rocked and swayed under the weight of history, but its echoes continue to resonate in our everyday lives. And so, dear listeners, as you drift off to sleep tonight, take a moment to appreciate the legacy of Mesopotamia, a civilization that, despite its tumultuous end, left behind a world forever changed. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that while empires may crumble, the stories they leave behind are eternal, sweet dreams, and may your dreams be filled with ancient wonders and modern wisdom. Antoni Gaudí, the maestro of Catalan architecture who seemed to have a hotline to the divine when it came to design, kicked off his life in 1852 in the small town of Reus, near Tarragona. Now, if you're thinking, a serene, uneventful childhood in the Spanish sun, think again. Gaudí's early years were a series of unfortunate health crises that would make a hypochondriac quiver. He was often too ill to join his siblings in play, which meant a lot of time spent indoors sketching while his peers were out kicking whatever passed for a soccer ball back then. Perhaps it was these illnesses that nudged him toward vegetarianism, a rarity in 19th century Spain where jamón is practically a food group, but it worked for him. He lived to the ripe age of 73, so maybe there's something to be said for greens over grains. Gaudí's health-imposed solitude also gave him ample time to think, dream, and, most importantly, observe. You've got to wonder if his unique perspective on architecture, those swooping organic forms, was born out of long hours spent studying the curves of the natural world from a window seat. Fast forward to his education at the Barcelona Higher School of Architecture, and you see a young man whose designs were as likely to provoke a "what the heck is that?" as they were to earn applause. His classmates and professors were often torn between admiration and a need to double-check their glasses to ensure they were seeing correctly. In 1878, when Gaudí completed his studies, his talent was undeniable, even if his aesthetics were, let's say, ahead of their time. He was handed his degree by Elis Rogent, the director of the school, who famously remarked, "Who knows if we have given this diploma to a nut or a genius? Time will tell." Spoiler alert, time was kind to Gaudí, though not without a few bumps along the way. One of Gaudí's first commissions was a series of lampposts for Barcelona's Plaça Real. Now, designing lampposts might sound about as thrilling as watching paint dry, but Gaudí, ever the visionary, saw an opportunity to inject some panache into the mundane. His designs featured wrought-iron serpents and helmets. Think medieval knight meets electrical utility. When the city council saw his plans, their reaction could best be described as, "Is this a joke?" They were deemed too avant-garde, too outlandish, and probably too expensive. But Gaudí's persistence paid off, and eventually those lampposts went up. Although they didn't exactly cause a stampede of imitators, they did signal the beginning of his legendary career. What makes Gaudí's story so compelling isn't just the fantastical buildings he left behind, but the way his unique perspective clashed and eventually harmonized with the world around him. In the late 19th century, Barcelona was a city in flux, straddling the line between traditionalism and modernity. Industrialization was in full swing, yet the old Catalan traditions still held sway. It was a perfect storm for an artist like Gaudí, a man with one foot in the mystical and the other in the practical realm of beams, bricks and mortar. Gaudí wasn't just a dreamer lost in his sketches, he was acutely aware of the social and political issues of his time. As Barcelona expanded during the industrial boom, the social divide became more apparent. Gaudí's work often reflected a desire to bridge that gap, to create spaces that were not just functional, but uplifting. His early projects might not have had the grandeur of his later works like the Sagrada Família, but they were imbued with the same spirit of innovation and social consciousness. So, as we dive into the world of Gaudí, remember that behind every swirling facade and every intricate mosaic is a story of a man who dared to challenge the status quo. He was a maverick in a bowler hat, armed with a pencil and a vision that defied conventional wisdom. And if anyone tells you that lampposts can't be revolutionary, just point them to Plaça Real and let Gaudí's early work speak for itself. Just as Gaudí's lampposts flickered to life in Plaça Real, something else sparked on the horizon. A partnership that would change the architectural landscape of Barcelona and firmly plant Gaudí in the annals of history. Enter Eusebi Güell, the industrialist, with a taste for the avant-garde and a wallet deep enough to fund it. It's as if fate decided to play matchmaker, pairing a visionary architect with a patron who was not just willing but eager to bankroll the eccentric. Their collaboration was a perfect storm of opportunity and innovation. Güell wasn't just your average businessman. He was a textile magnate with a penchant for the arts, and he saw in Gaudí a kindred spirit. They first crossed paths at the 1878 Paris World's Fair, where Gaudí's showcase caught Güell's eye. It wasn't long before Güell commissioned Gaudí to design a showpiece that would double as his urban palace, and thus Palau Güell was born. Now, Palau Güell wasn't just any mansion. No, this was a statement piece, the kind of home that screams, "I've got money, and I'm going to spend it in the most fabulous way possible." Completed in 1888, the house featured a parabolic arch, because why settle for straight lines when you can have curves, and chimneys that looked like candy-coloured chess pieces? Gaudí's attention to detail was legendary, to the point where the workers probably had nightmares about him peering over their shoulders, scrutinizing every tile. Not just any tile, mind you. Gaudí was known to personally inspect each one, ensuring they fit his vision precisely, much to the exasperation of his crew. They might have grumbled, but there was no denying the result was extraordinary. While Gaudí and Güell were busy dreaming up architectural wonders, Spain was undergoing its own transformation. The late 19th century was a time of political upheaval and economic flux. The country grappled with the aftershocks of losing its American colonies, which threw a wrench into its economy. In Barcelona, industrialization was both a boon and a bane, creating wealth but also exacerbating social divides. The city was a cauldron of tensions, with workers demanding better conditions while the elite clung to their privileges. It was a turbulent backdrop that made Gaudí's work all the more significant. Gaudí wasn't oblivious to these issues. His designs often reflected a desire to create harmony, to bridge the gap between opulence and accessibility. Take Park Güell, for example, another collaboration with his favourite patron. Initially conceived in 1900 as a housing development for the well-heeled, it was Gaudí's attempt to blend urban living with nature. Picture a housing complex where the natural landscape is not just preserved, but celebrated. An early nod to sustainable living, if you will. Though the project flopped commercially, only 2 houses were sold, it eventually became one of Barcelona's most beloved public parks. Talk about turning lemons into lemonade. Gaudí's meticulous nature didn't just stop at tiles or chimneys. His obsession with detail extended to every facet of his work. When designing Casa Batalló, a remodel of an existing building on Barcelona's Passeig de Gràcia, he reportedly spent hours on site, painstakingly overseeing the placement of each mosaic piece. His workers might have rolled their eyes, but Gaudí was the kind of man who would rather lose sleep than compromise on a single curve or colour. His relentless pursuit of perfection was both his hallmark and his curse. But let's pause here for a reality check. It's tempting to see Gaudí as a solitary genius, a man driven purely by vision. Yet, like any good myth, this one glosses over the less glamorous truths. For one, Gaudí was a savvy operator who understood the necessity of patronage. He was a man who knew how to play the game, leveraging his connections to secure the commissions that would allow him to turn his dreams into reality. And while his projects often courted controversy and ran over budget, a downside to insisting on custom tiles, it was his ability to adapt and innovate that kept him in the game. Against this backdrop of architectural experimentation and social tension, Gaudí's work stood out not just for its beauty, but for its boldness. He dared to challenge the status quo with designs that were as much about form as they were about function. His buildings were living organisms, each with its own personality, and they demanded to be noticed. In a world that often valued conformity, Gaudí was a beacon of originality. As we continue to unravel the story of Antoni Gaudí, keep in mind that behind every architectural marvel lay a man who was as complex as his creations. He was a dreamer, yes, but also a pragmatist who understood the intricacies of his time. His rise to fame wasn't just the result of talent or luck, it was a testament to his ability to navigate the shifting landscapes of politics, economy, and society. And with Güell as his partner in creation, Gaudí had the freedom to push boundaries in ways that would leave a lasting legacy. So, hold on to your hats, because the journey through Gaudí's world is only just beginning, and there's plenty more to marvel at. Speaking of marvels, let's dive nose first into the swirling, towering enigma that is the Sagrada Família. This is Gaudí's pièce de résistance, his magnum opus, or, as some might say, his beautiful, chaotic masterpiece that's still under construction more than a century later. And here's a kicker for you. When Gaudí started working on this Gothic meets Art Nouveau cathedral in 1883, he probably didn't envision it becoming the longest-running construction project since the Great Wall of China. But life, as they say, happens when you're busy making architectural plans. The Sagrada Família is more than just a basilica. It's a symphony of stone and symbolism that seems to defy gravity, let alone convention. The project originally kicked off under architect Francisco de Paula del Villar, but when he threw in the trowel due to disagreements over design, Gaudí stepped in, and boy did he run with it. Or rather, he crawled, because Gaudí's vision was ambitious, to say the least. The man famously quipped, "My client is not in a hurry," referring to God. Talk about a divine deadline extension. Financing this colossal endeavour was, predictably, a Herculean task. While Gaudí had patrons like Güell to support some of his other projects, the Sagrada Família was a different beast altogether. It relied on private donations and has since become a sort of eternal GoFundMe before GoFundMe was a thing. In 1915, the project was brought to a grinding halt due to financial constraints, a recurring theme that would haunt the basilica's construction like a spectre. Fast forward to today, and the estimated completion date is 2026, marking 100 years since Gaudí's death. If nothing else, the basilica is a testament to human patience and the power of crowdfunding before the internet age. Now, let's talk engineering challenges. Building something that looks like a cross between a sandcastle and an alien spaceship isn't exactly a walk in the park. The Sagrada Família is composed of 18 spires, each representing a different religious figure, and is intended to tower over Barcelona at 170.25 meters, just shy of Montjuic Hill. Why not taller than the hill, you ask? Gaudí believed human creations shouldn't surpass God's. Humbling, if not a tad self-deprecating, for a man who was essentially designing a skyscraper. The complex geometric forms that define the basilica are a testament to Gaudí's obsession with nature and mathematics. He used hyperboloids, paraboloids, and helicoids, words that sound like they belong in a physics textbook rather than an architectural blueprint. Gaudí's designs were a meticulous blend of art and science, and his understanding of geometry was, frankly, otherworldly. He was the sort of chap who could look at a seashell and think, that curve would make a great column. But let's not forget the hallowed mythos surrounding Gaudí himself. Legend has it that he experienced a spiritual awakening, a sort of architectural enlightenment that drove him to dedicate his life to the Sagrada Família. The reality, however, is that Gaudí was always a religious man, and his faith was a guiding force throughout his career. What did change was the depth of his devotion, which became more pronounced as he aged. By the time he was fully immersed in the basilica's construction, Gaudí had adopted a lifestyle that some might describe as monk-like, though others might call it downright eccentric. Gone were the days of hobnobbing with the elite or indulging in the bohemian lifestyle of his youth. Gaudí became reclusive, reportedly living in the workshop of the Sagrada Família like a hermit in his cave. He eschewed worldly possessions and was often seen wearing worn-out clothes, earning him the nickname the madman in the old coat. Whether his lifestyle was a genuine expression of asceticism or a clever PR move to secure funding from devout Catholics is up for debate. But one thing's for sure, Gaudí was as committed to his craft as a cat is to napping. His relationships with collaborators were as complex as the basilica itself. Gaudí was known for his demanding nature, a perfectionist who was as likely to inspire awe as he was to induce eye-rolls. He famously claimed to live only by the grace of God, which sounds poetic until you realize it probably made project meetings a bit awkward. Why is the column 3 weeks behind schedule? I'm waiting for divine intervention. Not exactly the project management style they teach in business school. Yet, despite, or perhaps because of his eccentricities, Gaudí's work on the Sagrada Família has captivated millions. It's a structure that embodies both the celestial and the earthly, a testament to human ingenuity and divine inspiration. The basilica isn't just a building, it's an experience, a pilgrimage site for architects and tourists alike who come to marvel at its soaring spires and intricate facades. As we continue to explore Gaudí's world, remember that behind every stone and every curve lies a story of ambition, faith, and an unyielding pursuit of beauty. The Sagrada Família stands as a monument not just to Gaudí's genius, but to the power of a vision that transcends time. So, while we ponder the myths and realities of Gaudí's life, let's not forget that his true legacy is written in the skyline of Barcelona, a city forever changed by the dreamer who dared to build for eternity. The skyline of Barcelona might forever bear Gaudí's imprint, but let's not forget the man behind the masterpiece was as intriguing as the work itself. As Gaudí trudged deeper into his later years, the man once celebrated for his flamboyant designs began to retreat into himself, like a snail into its shell. His reclusive lifestyle wasn't just a phase, it was a full-blown life choice. We're talking about a guy who, by the turn of the 20th century, had swapped out the social scene for solitude, swapping fine suits for threadbare clothes. Think less dashing artist and more absent-minded professor. By the 1910s, Gaudí's focus had narrowed down to an almost obsessive degree. His architectural style took on an even more organic form, as if the buildings themselves were growing straight out of the earth. Forget straight lines and right angles. Gaudí was all about curves and colours that mimicked the natural world. The Casa Milà, or La Pedrera as it's affectionately known, completed in 1912, is a perfect example of this evolution. The facade undulates like waves, and the rooftop chimneys look like they were plucked from a Dr. Seuss book. It's as if Gaudí was channeling Mother Nature herself, or at least her more whimsical side. But while Gaudí was busy bending steel and sculpting stone into surreal forms, Spain was grappling with its own set of challenges. The early 20th century was not kind to the Spanish economy. The loss of its last colonies in 1898 had dealt a severe blow, and by the time the Great War rolled around, Spain was stuck in a cycle of political instability and economic downturns. Inflation was on the rise, and unemployment was creeping into double digits. This economic malaise didn't just affect everyday folks, it also put the squeeze on ambitious architectural projects. Gaudí felt the pinch like everyone else. The funding for his grand designs wasn't exactly rolling in like a tidal wave. The Sagrada Família, already a financial black hole, became even more of a challenge as donations dwindled. Yet Gaudí, ever the optimist or perhaps just stubborn, continued to pour every ounce of his energy into the basilica. His devotion bordered on the fanatical, and his living arrangements became more monastic by the year. By the 1920s he was living on-site at the Sagrada Família, eating little more than bread and milk, and dedicating himself entirely to his work. Now, you might think a man so singularly focused would have his life together, at least in a practical sense. But Gaudí's absent-mindedness was legendary. Imagine being so engrossed in a study of a flower that you forget to attend the opening of your own building. Yes, that happened. In 1910, he missed the inauguration of the Colonia Güell's crypt because he was too busy admiring the geometry of a leaf. It's comedic, sure, but it also reveals a man whose priorities were entirely his own. His head was in the clouds, but his heart was firmly planted in the soil. As Gaudí's reclusiveness deepened, so too did his reliance on a select group of collaborators who could translate his increasingly abstract visions into reality. These were loyal disciples, trained to read between Gaudí's eccentric lines. Yet, even they must have questioned his methods at times. Gaudí was known for sketching plans in the sand or bending wires into models, a practice that was less engineering and more interpretive dance. One can only imagine the head-scratching and eye-rolling that went on among his team. But if Gaudí was a riddle wrapped in an enigma, his work was an open book for those willing to decipher it. His designs didn't just push boundaries, they obliterated them. His growing preference for organic forms wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about philosophy. Gaudí believed nature was God's own architecture, and he sought to emulate it in his buildings. This wasn't just an artistic choice, it was a spiritual one. For Gaudí, every curve and colour was a testament to a higher power, a tangible expression of divine inspiration. Yet, let's not romanticize too much. This shift toward the organic also reflected a practical reality. The times were changing, and so was the market for architecture. The Industrial Revolution had brought about new materials and methods, and Gaudí was savvy enough to incorporate these innovations into his work. He was no purist stuck in the past, he was a visionary ready to harness the future. As the clock ticked towards the end of his life, Gaudí's world shrank even further. His days were consumed by the Sagrada Família, and he rarely ventured beyond its confines. He was becoming something of an urban legend, the eccentric architect who lived among his creations. In June 1926, Gaudí was struck by a tram while on one of his rare excursions outside. His unkempt appearance led passers-by to mistake him for a beggar, delaying medical attention. He died 3 days later, on June 10th, leaving behind a legacy as unfinished as the basilica he devoted his life to. Gaudí's later years were a paradox, a blend of isolation and inspiration, of solitude and spectacle. He was a man who seemed to live in a world of his own making, a world where buildings breathed and stones sang. But for all his genius, Gaudí was also a product of his time, shaped by the economic and social forces that swirled around him. His work was a response to these pressures, an attempt to find harmony in a world that often seemed anything but harmonious. So, as we ponder the life and legacy of Antoni Gaudí, let's remember that behind every whimsical design was a man who defied convention and dared to dream. He was a creator and a recluse, a visionary and a pragmatist. His life was a testament to the power of imagination and the courage to follow it, no matter where it might lead. And as we continue this journey through Gaudí's world, let's keep our eyes open for the unexpected, for the stories that lie just beneath the surface of his fantastical facades. After all, in Gaudí's world, there's always more than meets the eye. For Gaudí, The streets of Barcelona were always a kind of personal playground, a backdrop to his architectural theatrics. But in one tragic twist of fate, those very streets became the stage for his untimely demise. On June 7, 1926, the artist who dared to mould stone into dreams was struck by a tram, a moment that seemed all too pedestrian for a man of such imaginative grandeur. Yet, perhaps it was fitting for someone who lived his life in the public eye to meet his end in the city's heart. Mistaken for a vagrant due to his shabby attire, he was taken to a pauper's hospital, where he remained unrecognized until it was too late. 3 days later, on June 10th, he passed away, leaving behind a legacy as complex and unfinished as the Sagrada Família itself. Gaudí's funeral drew massive crowds, a testament to the impact he had on the city he adored. It was a farewell befitting a man whose life's work had become synonymous with Barcelona itself. His body was interred in the crypt of the Sagrada Família, a fitting resting place for the man who had dedicated over 40 years of his life to its construction. Yet, as the dust settled on his grave, the question lingered, what now? Gaudí left behind sketches and models, but completing his magnum opus without his guiding hand would prove to be a monumental challenge. Fast forward nearly a century, and the Sagrada Família is still under construction, a living testament to both Gaudí's genius and the complexities of architectural continuity. Set to be completed in 2026, exactly 100 years after his death, it challenges our notions of authenticity. Can a building still be considered the work of its original architect when so many hands have shaped it? Purists argue that the basilica should remain unfinished, a poignant reminder of Gaudí's vision. Others view its completion as a tribute, a way to finally realize the dream he once held so passionately. The ongoing construction also raises questions about fidelity to Gaudí's vision. Modern architects have had to interpret his plans, a task akin to deciphering hieroglyphs without the Rosetta Stone. The original models were damaged during the Spanish Civil War, leaving only fragmented clues about his intentions. Consequently, the Sagrada Família today is as much a product of contemporary interpretation as it is of Gaudí's original design. It's a bit like playing a game of architectural telephone, where each generation adds its own twist. Yet, despite, or perhaps because of, these challenges, the basilica stands as a beacon of innovation. It's a playground for architects and engineers, a testament to what can be achieved when old-world craftsmanship meets modern technology. The use of digital modeling and 3D printing has sped up construction, a far cry from the hand-carved stones of Gaudí's time. These advancements have allowed for the completion of intricate details that might have otherwise remained theoretical. It's a fascinating blend of the old and the new, a literal and metaphorical bridge between centuries. Gaudí's influence doesn't stop at the Sagrada Família. It permeates modern architecture and pop culture like a ripple effect. His organic forms and bold use of color have inspired not just buildings, but video games, fashion, and even films. You can see echoes of his style in the whimsical landscapes of video games like Monument Valley, where players navigate through Escher-like environments that wouldn't look out of place in a Gaudí sketchbook. In fashion, designers draw on his bold palettes and textures, creating pieces that are as much about form as they are about function. The fascination with Gaudí's work lies not just in its beauty, but in its audacity. He dared to dream of a world where buildings weren't just structures, but living entities that breathed and interacted with their surroundings. His willingness to defy convention and embrace the fantastical speaks to a universal desire for creativity unfettered by the mundane. It's no wonder that his work continues to captivate and inspire, serving as a reminder that architecture is not just about bricks and mortar, but about the stories they tell and the emotions they evoke. Of course, Gaudí's legacy isn't without its controversies. Some view his work as overly indulgent, a fever dream that borders on the impractical. Critics argue that his designs prioritize aesthetics over functionality, a valid point when you consider the logistical challenges posed by his unconventional forms. Yet, these criticisms often miss the larger picture. Gaudí's work challenges us to rethink the role of architecture, to see it not just as a utilitarian necessity, but as an art form capable of provoking thought and eliciting emotion. His life and work also serve as a poignant reminder of the complexities of genius. Gaudí was a man of contradictions, both a visionary and a pragmatist, a recluse and a public figure. His story is one of perseverance in the face of adversity, of finding beauty in the everyday and daring to dream beyond the confines of reality. It's a narrative that resonates with anyone who has ever dared to challenge the status quo, who has ever looked at a blank canvas and seen possibilities rather than limitations. As we wrap up this journey through Gaudí's world, let's consider the lessons his life offers. In a world often obsessed with efficiency and conformity, Gaudí reminds us that there is value in taking the road less travelled, in daring to dream big and bold. His legacy is a testament to the power of imagination, a celebration of creativity that continues to inspire and challenge us even today. So, the next time you find yourself strolling through the streets of Barcelona, or perhaps simply admiring the curves of a building or the play of light on a surface, take a moment to appreciate the invisible hand of Gaudí, guiding us toward a world where architecture isn't just built, but born. And in that world, there's always room for a little magic. In the bustling 13th century Venice, where the air was thick with the scent of salt water and ambition, young Marco Polo was about to embark on the kind of career path that would make a modern travel influencer green with envy. Instead of Instagramming his way across continents, Marco was set to become the medieval poster child for adventure. But let's not kid ourselves. This journey was no leisurely stroll. It was a high-stakes, gritty trek through lands that most Venetians only whispered about over their evening polenta. Marco's initiation into the world of trade and travel began in 1269. At just 15 years old, he was thrust into the whirlwind of a family business that was less about balancing the books and more about navigating the treacherous Silk Road. The Polo family had already made a name for themselves, with Marco's father, Nickel, and uncle, Maffeo, having previously ventured to the east. They returned with tales of grandeur and opportunity that could make any young man's eyes widen with wonder. Or was it terror? Forget the romantic notions of Marco saving the Mediterranean on a luxury yacht. In reality, medieval travel was about as glamorous as a muddy boot. The journey to the east began with a trek that stretched thousands of miles across some of the most inhospitable terrain imaginable. Picture this: a caravan plodding along at a snail's pace, covering a mere 20 miles a day if the weather and fate were kind. And let's not overlook the ever-present threat of bandits, disease, and the occasional diplomatic snafu. These were the real monsters under Marco's bed. Marco's first big adventure was not in some exotic locale, but in the less-than-exotic realm of medieval logistics. The Polo family had to cough up a small fortune just to get their caravan geared up for the journey. Historical records suggest that the cost of outfitting such an expedition could easily run into hundreds of gold ducats. Imagine buying a luxury car today, but instead of leather seats, you're investing in camels and pack mules. One of the first comedic hiccups of Marco's journey was his introduction to fermented mare's milk, known as krumies. It might sound exotic, but to Marco it was a pungent liquid that tasted like something that had been sitting in the sun for a few too many days. Let's just say it was an acquired taste, and Marco's first encounter with it was likely less of a culinary delight and more of a stomach-churning experience. Now, here's a myth that needs immediate debunking: the idea that Marco Polo was an experienced traveller from the get-go. In truth, when he first set out, Marco was as green as they come. He might have had the Polo name, but he was still a teenager, thrust into a world that was equal parts fascinating and terrifying. Marco had to learn quickly and adapt even faster, a crash course in survival that no textbook could teach. Politically speaking, the world Marco was entering was a patchwork of empires and kingdoms, each with its own set of rules and rulers. The Polos were savvy traders who knew that aligning with the right political factions could mean the difference between a warm welcome and a cold shoulder. This was no small feat in an era when alliances were as changeable as the wind. Marco had to master the art of diplomacy alongside his father and uncle, a skill that would prove invaluable in the years to come. Life on the road was far from the romanticized vision of exotic lands and endless riches. For Marco, it was more about enduring the endless dust of the Gobi Desert and the frigid winds of the Pamir Mountains. It was about surviving on whatever provisions could be scrounged up along the way, often stretching meagre rations to last weeks. And let's not forget the language barrier. Marco had to pick up new languages and dialects on the fly, an impressive feat for any teenager. By the time the Polo family reached the court of Kublai Khan, Marco had already been transformed from a Venetian novice into a seasoned traveller. The Khan, ruler of the largest empire the world had ever seen, was a man whose curiosity matched his power. He was fascinated by the tales of the West that Marco and his family brought with them. Marco, for his part, was equally captivated by the grandeur of the Khan's court, a place where opulence and power converged in a way that no European court could rival. The stage was set for Marco Polo's epic journey, but let's not forget the gritty details that got him there. The reality of medieval travel was harsh and unyielding, a stark contrast to the romantic tales that would later emerge. Marco's early adventures were a testament to the resilience and adaptability required to survive in a world where the only constant was change. As Marco stood on the precipice of his legendary journey, he had already learned one invaluable lesson. The road may be long and arduous, but the stories it held were worth every step. And so, Marco Polo, now a scrappy veteran of the Silk Road, found himself at the bustling crossroads of commerce and culture that was the Mongol Empire. This was no small feat. The Silk Road, a network of trade routes stretching over 4,000 miles, was the medieval equivalent of a global highway, if the highway came with sandstorms, bandits, and the occasional plague. It was the kind of place where fortunes were made and lost faster than you could say spice trade. One of the first myths we need to pop like an overinflated balloon is the romanticized notion of the Silk Road as a singular, glittering path lined with treasures. In reality, it was more like a choose-your-own-adventure book with the wrong pages missing. Each segment of the journey came with its own set of challenges and quirks. Marco had to navigate deserts that could swallow a caravan whole and mountains that seemed to stretch into infinity, all while trying to avoid becoming a footnote in history as that guy who got lost in the Taklamakan desert. But it wasn't just the terrain that was tricky. Marco and his family had to deal with a patchwork quilt of customs and practices that could boggle the mind. Take, for instance, the Mongol postal system. It was a marvel of efficiency, with relay stations every 25 to 30 miles manned by riders who could cover up to 200 miles a day. It was like Amazon Prime, but with horses and without the 2-day guarantee. This network was crucial for the Mongols, who needed to keep their sprawling empire connected. For traders like Marco, it was both a blessing and a bureaucratic nightmare, requiring permits and taxes that could make a modern-day tax return look simple. Now let's chat about Xanadu, the so-called Golden Cities that has fueled countless poetic fantasies. Samuel Taylor Coleridge famously dreamt about it, but Marco was wide awake when he arrived. The city was indeed impressive, but it wasn't the gilded metropolis of legend. Kublai Khan's summer capital was more a testament to the Mongols' power and architectural flair than a literal treasure trove. The reality? Spacious pavilions, lush gardens, and a palace made of marble and wood, not solid gold. The opulence was in the eye of the beholder, and Marco's tales were the Instagram filters of his day, enhancing the beauty while glossing over the mundane. Of course, Marco's travels weren't just about sightseeing. The economic motivations driving these journeys were as palpable as the sweat on his brow. Silk, spices, and precious stones were the currency of the day, and demand in Europe was insatiable. The Polos were in it for the long game, looking to establish trade routes that would fill Venetian coffers for generations. But trading in the East wasn't like haggling at the local bazaar. It involved complex negotiations with Mongol officials who valued gifts as much as goods. Think of it as corporate diplomacy with a side of barter. Speaking of Mongol bureaucracy, imagine trying to fill out paperwork with officials who changed policies as often as they changed horses. The Polos had to navigate a labyrinth of permits and permissions, each stamped with the approval of officials who didn't always see eye to eye. Marco's father and uncle had already laid some groundwork on their previous journey, but the landscape had changed, both literally and figuratively. The Mongol Empire was vast, and Marco had to learn quickly how to play the game of politics, often relying on his keen observation skills and knack for languages. As Marco wound his way through this complex web of cultures and commerce, he encountered practices that would seem bizarre to a Venetian lad. Take the use of paper money, for example. While Europe was still clinking coins, the Mongols had embraced the convenience of currency made from mulberry bark. To Marco, it must have seemed like magic pieces of paper that held the power to buy goods and curry favor with officials. It was revolutionary, and Marco knew it, noting its practicality and widespread acceptance in his accounts. Yet, amidst the economic and cultural marvels, there were harsh realities that couldn't be ignored. Disease was a constant companion, lurking in every crowded marketplace and along every dusty trail. The Black Death would later sweep across Europe, but the seeds of that catastrophe were already being sown along these trade routes. Marco had to navigate not just the physical challenges of his journey, but the invisible threats that travelled with him. In this whirlwind of trade and travel, Marco Polo was both an observer and a participant. He chronicled the details of his journey with an eye for the extraordinary, but also with a Venetian merchant's understanding of the bottom line. His accounts were filled with tales of wonder, but they were also grounded in the economic realities of his time. Marco's ability to blend the mythical with the practical is what made his stories so compelling, and why we're still talking about them today. As Marco continued his travels, he learned firsthand the power of storytelling. His narratives would later captivate audiences across Europe, but it's important to remember that they were born from a life lived on the edge of the known world. The Silk Road was not just a route, it was a crucible that tested the mettle of those who dared to traverse it. Marco emerged from it not just as a traveller, but as a chronicler of a world that was both familiar and foreign. The road was long and fraught with danger, but for Marco, the stories and the knowledge they contained were worth every dusty mile. And so, Marco Polo found himself at the dazzling court of Kublai Khan, where opulence wasn't just a lifestyle choice, but a full-time job. The Mongol Empire at its zenith was like nothing Marco had ever seen, or could have even dreamt up on a particularly imaginative day. The sheer scale and grandeur of Kublai Khan's court would make Versailles look like a charming countryside retreat. But let's not get too misty-eyed with admiration. Being in the Khan's court was both a privilege and a pressure cooker of political maneuvering. You see, Kublai Khan wasn't your run-of-the-mill ruler. He was the grandson of Genghis Khan, a name that practically screamed world domination in the 13th century. Kublai had an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe, an expanse that would make even today's global superpowers sweat with envy. In a world where most people's travel plans didn't extend beyond the next village, Kublai ruled over a domain that spanned around 13 million square kilometers. That's roughly the size of modern-day Russia. Let that sink in. Marco's arrival at the court marked the beginning of a new chapter in his already epic journey. But don't break out the party hats just yet. His role as a foreign envoy was less about basking in luxury and more about navigating a labyrinth of Mongolian bureaucracy and intrigue. Kublai Khan, with his insatiable curiosity about the West, saw Marco as a walking encyclopedia, a guide to the lands of Christendom and beyond. Cue the cultural exchanges, the miscommunications, and the hilarity that ensued. Let's talk opulence. The court of Kublai Khan was the medieval equivalent of a 5-star resort, if your idea of luxury includes an entourage of thousands and a treasury that could finance a small nation. Marco described the Khan's summer palace in Chengdu. Yes, that's the Xanadu of literary fame, as a grand spectacle with vast halls filled with silk-draped walls and a dazzling array of precious stones. But here's the kicker. While Marco's tales painted Xanadu as a fantastical wonderland, the reality was a bit less magical and more practical. The palace wasn't made of gold, but of stone and wood, more a testament to Mongol engineering than to fairy tale architecture. Kublai Khan was a man who appreciated the finer things in life, like the good sense to employ a fleet of foreign advisors to keep his empire running smoothly. Marco found himself not just as a guest, but as a valued member of this elite circle. The Khan, ever the savvy ruler, put Marco to work on diplomatic missions, sending him off to various corners of the empire. For Marco, it was a crash course in Mongolian geopolitics, and a chance to witness firsthand the workings of the largest empire in human history. But hold on to your horses. Literally. Travelling as a Mongol envoy was no leisurely jaunt. Marco had to contend with the same grueling distances and formidable landscapes he had faced on his journey to the court. The difference? Now, he had the backing of the Khan's name and a pile of official documents that acted like medieval passports. These passes, emblazoned with the great Khan's seal, were like golden tickets, granting him passage and provisions across the empire. But they also came with expectations. Failure was not an option when representing the ruler of the known world. Now, let's dive into the nitty-gritty of Marco's role. His tasks range from negotiating trade deals to delivering messages. No small feat in an empire where messages travelled by horseback and could take weeks, if not months, to reach their destination. Marco's knack for languages and his ability to adapt quickly made him an asset in these diplomatic endeavours. Yet, it wasn't all work and no play. Marco's interactions with the court were peppered with moments of cultural exchange, where Venetian and Mongolian worlds collided in both enlightening and comical ways. Take, for instance, the court's fascination with Western customs. Marco, ever the raconteur, regaled the Khan and his court with stories of European life, from the intricacies of Venetian politics to the peculiarities of Catholic rituals. These tales were met with both curiosity and skepticism, a reminder of the vast cultural chasm that lay between East and West. And let's not forget Marco's own learning curve. His initial struggle with Mongolian etiquette was a comedy of errors, a reminder that even the savviest travellers can stumble over cultural faux pas. Kublai Khan, for all his power, was a ruler who valued knowledge as much as conquest. He surrounded himself with scholars, artists and thinkers from across the empire, creating a vibrant melting pot of ideas and innovation. Marco, with his keen eye and insatiable curiosity, soaked up these experiences like a sponge. He documented everything from the intricacies of Mongolian governance to the peculiarities of local customs, laying the groundwork for the accounts that would later captivate Europe. But let's not romanticize the court as a utopian sanctuary of wisdom and culture. Beneath the surface lay a web of political intrigue and power struggles that would make a Game of Thrones plotline look like child's play. The Mongol court was a hotbed of ambition, where alliances shifted like sand dunes in a desert storm. Marco had to tread carefully, balancing his growing influence with the ever-present risk of falling out of favour. The Khan's court was a place where one wrong move could lead to a swift exit, sometimes with a one-way ticket to obscurity or worse. And then there were the misunderstandings, those delightful moments where cultural differences sparked confusion and, occasionally, laughter. Marco's accounts tell of his astonishment at Mongolian customs, from their dietary habits to their fashion choices. But let's flip the script. Imagine how Marco must have appeared to the Mongols, with his European manners and strange attire. The court was a stage where these cultural exchanges played out, each side learning, adapting, and sometimes scratching their heads in bewilderment. Despite the challenges and the occasional faux pas, Marco's time at the court was transformative. He gained a rare insight into the workings of an empire that was as vast as it was complex. The experience shaped him, turning him from a wide-eyed traveller into a seasoned diplomat. Marco's ability to navigate this world of power and prestige was a testament to his adaptability and resilience, a survival skill as valuable as any treasure. As Marco Polo immersed himself in the life of Kublai Khan's court, he learned an invaluable lesson. Power, like beauty, often lies in the eye of the beholder. The opulence of the Mongol Empire wasn't just in its gold and silk, but in its ability to command loyalty and inspire awe across continents. Marco's tales, filled with both fantastical elements and gritty truths, captured the duality of this world, a place where myths were born, but where reality was never far behind. The stage was set for Marco Polo to continue his journey not just as a traveller, but as a chronicler of one of history's most remarkable empires. His time at the court of Kublai Khan was a turning point, a chapter filled with diplomacy, discovery, and the kind of stories that would echo through the ages. And so, with the court's intrigue and splendour as his backdrop, Marco Polo pressed on, ready to tackle the next leg of his legendary journey. With Marco Polo finally ready to bid adieu to the grandeur of Kublai Khan's court, the Venetian found himself at a crossroads, both literally and metaphorically. He was set to return home, but the path back to Venice was fraught with its own brand of medieval chaos. Picture this: a journey that twisted through political landmines, logistical nightmares, and, of course, the ever-watchful eyes of the Mongol bureaucracy. And no, there wasn't a Google Maps option for least dangerous route. Marco's departure wasn't just a casual wave goodbye. No, it was more like navigating a diplomatic minefield. Kublai Khan, having grown fond of his Venetian guest, was hesitant to let him leave. You see, losing Marco was akin to losing a walking, talking encyclopedia of Western culture. So, the Khan tried to delay Marco's exit. A bit like when you open a new Netflix series knowing full well you have work tomorrow. Eventually, a diplomatic mission to escort a Mongol princess to Persia provided the perfect cover for Marco to make his escape. Cue the clandestine exit, and the sense of adventure rekindled in our traveller. But let's not sugarcoat it. The journey back was about as glamorous as a wet sock. Marco and his family, having spent 24 years away, were now at the mercy of the sea. The voyage was long, treacherous, and peppered with storms that could make even the most seasoned sailor consider a career change. Nearly 700 passengers set sail, but only a fraction survived the turbulent waters and disease-ridden conditions. By the time they docked at the Persian Gulf, the entourage had been reduced to a handful of weary survivors. Talk about a travel horror story. When Marco finally set foot back in Venice around 1295, he was not greeted by throngs of cheering admirers. Nope. He walked into a city that barely remembered him. While he was off rubbing elbows with Mongol royalty, Venice had been busy fighting its own battles, both literal and political. Marco's return was less a triumphant homecoming and more a quiet shuffle back into a rapidly evolving society. Of course, the myth of Marco Polo, the wealthy adventurer, precedes him. Legend would have you believe he returned with unimaginable wealth, bags bursting with jewels and spices. The reality? A bit of a letdown. The Polos did bring back some treasures, but they were hardly the Venetian equivalent of lottery winners. In fact, Marco had to deal with a rather anticlimactic legal squabble over a ship's cargo. Picture him, fresh off a globe-trotting escapade, embroiled in a dispute over logistics. It's like returning from an exotic vacation only to find your luggage lost at the airport. This cargo debacle wasn't just a metaphorical slap to the face, it was a reminder of the economic realities of the time. Venice, ever the mercantile powerhouse, was a place where trade disputes could make or break fortunes. The Polos had to navigate this commercial labyrinth, and Marco found himself caught in the legal machinery of his hometown, a stark contrast to the diplomatic missions he undertook in the Mongol Empire. And let's talk about Venice itself. Marco returned to a city that had changed dramatically in his absence. The Venice of 1295 was not the same as the one he left in the mid-13th century. The city was a bustling hub of commerce and intrigue, its canals teeming with the activity of a burgeoning economic giant. The political landscape had shifted, with new alliances forming and old ones dissolving faster than you could say Genoese rivalry. Venice was also grappling with the Black Death, which would soon sweep across Europe, leaving a profound mark on the continent. This pandemic was a chilling reminder of the interconnectedness of the medieval world, a world that Marco helped document through his travels. The disease exposed the vulnerabilities of a society that thrived on trade and travel, and Marco's stories would later serve as both a record and a warning of these turbulent times. But let's not get too grim. Marco Polo's tales, for all their embellishments, were a hot topic back in Europe. His accounts of foreign lands and exotic customs were met with a mix of skepticism and wonder. Some saw him as a storyteller extraordinaire, while others dismissed his tales as mere flights of fancy. Yet the allure of the unknown was too intoxicating to resist. People were captivated by his adventures, eager to hear of lands where paper money reigned and silks flowed like water. Marco's narratives became the medieval equivalent of a blockbuster series, sparking interest and debate across Europe. His ability to weave fact with fiction, intentionally or not, was a stroke of genius. This blend of myth and reality gave his stories an enduring appeal, a testament to the power of storytelling in shaping perceptions of the world. Marco was the ultimate travel influencer, long before hashtags and filtered selfies took over our digital lives. Back home, Marco found himself adapting to a society that was both familiar and foreign. He had to navigate the complex social dynamics of a city that was now a melting pot of cultures and ideas. The Venice of his youth had evolved, and Marco had to find his place in this new world. His stories, while celebrated, were also a source of contention. They challenged the established narratives of the time, offering a different perspective on a world that was both vast and interconnected. Marco Polo's return to Venice was a study in contrasts, a blend of myth and reality, triumph and anticlimax. His tales, filled with both fantastical elements and gritty truths, captured the imagination of a Europe on the brink of change. The social and economic realities of a returning traveller were both challenging and eye-opening, forcing Marco to confront a world that was as complex and unpredictable as the journeys he had undertaken. And so, with the echoes of his adventures still resonating, Marco Polo settled into Venetian life, ready to embark on the next chapter of his remarkable story. His journey back home was a testament to the enduring allure of the unknown, a reminder that the most compelling tales are often those that straddle the line between legend and reality. As Marco navigated the complexities of his post-travel life, his legacy as a chronicler of the world's wonders continued to grow, setting the stage for the final act of his legendary journey. But Marco Polo's story didn't sail off into the sunset just yet. You see, the final chapter of his adventure was about to be written back in Venice, not by the man himself, but through the words of a fellow named Rustichello da Pisa. While Marco was cooling his heels after those epic travels, Venice and Genoa were doing what rival states do best, squabbling. Marco, ever the Venetian, got himself captured during one of these little spats, ending up in a Genoese prison. It was there, while cooling his heels in captivity, that he met Rustichello, a writer with a penchant for the dramatic. Talk about a fortuitous meeting, like a medieval literary power couple, but with fewer hashtags. Together they penned what would become the Travels of Marco Polo, a book that would set European imaginations ablaze faster than you could say spice trade. But let's not kid ourselves, this wasn't just a dry travelogue. Marco's tales were sprinkled with just enough embellishment to make a modern-day tabloid editor proud. He spoke of lands where dog-headed men roamed, and of riches that would make Scrooge McDuck salivate. It was a blend of fantastical elements and gritty realities, a narrative cocktail that was as intoxicating as it was suspect. Now, let's talk about the reception. The book was a medieval bestseller, spreading faster across Europe than a meme about cats. But not everyone was buying what Marco was selling. Many readers treated his accounts with skepticism, dubbing him Il Milione, the man of a million lies. Marco, with his knack for weaving fact with fiction, became both a celebrity and a subject of ridicule. Yet the book's impact was undeniable. It was the spark that lit the fire of exploration, inspiring generations of adventurers who dreamed of lands beyond the horizon. Enter Christopher Columbus, a man who practically had Marco Polo's book glued to his hand. Columbus, like many others, was enchanted by the tales of Cipangu, Japan, and Cathay, China, places where gold was said to be as common as cobblestones in Venice. Marco's accounts, filled with tales of wealth and wonder, were like a siren's call to explorers eager to prove themselves and fill their coffers. It wasn't just about the allure of riches, though. Marco's stories painted a picture of a world teeming with possibilities, a world waiting to be discovered and claimed. But let's not ignore the economic context here. Europe in the late 13th century was hungry for trade routes and new resources. The Mongol Empire had facilitated a brief period of relative stability along the Silk Road, but by the time Columbus was charting his course, those routes were becoming increasingly fraught with political upheaval. The craving for direct access to the riches of the East became a catalyst for exploration, pushing European powers to seek sea routes that bypassed the land-based Silk Road. Marco Polo's tales were a tantalizing preview of what lay beyond, a testament to the potential rewards of these ventures. And then there was the skepticism, that ever-present shadow trailing behind Marco's legacy. Critics questioned the plausibility of his stories, pointing to inconsistencies and the lack of corroborating evidence in Chinese records. Some argued that Marco never set foot in China at all, suggesting instead that he compiled his accounts from second-hand stories and travellers he met along the way. Yet, like any good legend, the truth was likely somewhere in between, a mix of first-hand experience and embroidered narrative. Despite the doubts, Marco Polo's name endured, becoming synonymous with adventure and exploration. His legacy was further cemented by the Age of Discovery, where the boundaries of the known world expanded beyond belief. Explorers like Vasco da Gama and Ferdinand Magellan followed in the footsteps of Marco's narrative, driven by the same thirst for discovery that had propelled him across continents. His tales, though questioned, provided a roadmap of sorts, a glimpse into the potential riches and wonders that awaited beyond Europe's shores. And let's not forget the cultural impact. Marco Polo became a symbol, not just of exploration, but of curiosity and the human spirit's relentless pursuit of the unknown. His name found its way into literature, inspiring works like Coleridge's Kubla Khan, and even into our leisure activities. Who hasn't played the game of Marco Polo in a swimming pool, calling out into the void, much like the man himself, seeking the unseen? As we wrap up this tale of adventure, let's reflect on the legacy of Marco Polo. He was a man who straddled the line between reality and myth, a storyteller whose narratives captured the imagination of a continent on the brink of transformation. His travels, real or embellished, opened the door to a world of possibilities, challenging the boundaries of the known and inspiring generations to come. Marco Polo's name endures not just because of where he went, but because of what he represented, a beacon of curiosity in a world ripe for exploration. In the end, Marco Polo's story isn't just about the places he explored or the tales he told. It's about the power of storytelling itself, the ability to inspire and provoke, to challenge and entertain. His accounts serve as a reminder that history is often a tapestry of truth and fiction, woven together to create a narrative that resonates across time. So, as we close the book on Marco Polo, let's remember him not just as a traveller, but as a masterful storyteller who dared to dream beyond the horizon. In ancient Rome, the streets were alive with a cacophony of scents and sounds. Picture a bustling marketplace where the air is filled with the shouts of vendors and the sizzle of grills. It's the original fast food scene, without the drive-through window, but with enough culinary chaos to rival any modern food court. Forget the romanticized vision of Romans lounging on couches, lazily plucking grapes from a silver platter. For most, life was a little more grab-and-go than that, and street food was the grease that kept the wheels of urban life turning. Let's start with garum, the Roman answer to ketchup. This fermented fish sauce was the secret ingredient that Roman street vendors slathered on everything from snacks to full meals. Think of it as a flavor bomb, albeit one that might make you second-guess your life choices if you caught a whiff on a hot summer day. Garum was so popular, it was practically its own currency. The Romans had garum factories, and the best stuff, called liquamen, came with a price tag that would make today's organic foodies blush. According to Pliny the Elder, a single jar of the finest garum could cost as much as 1,000 sesterces, roughly the price of a Roman soldier's annual salary. Talk about a saucy investment. Street vendors, or thermopolia as they were known, were the beating heart of Rome's culinary fast lane. These were the ancient food trucks, minus the wheels. They lined the streets, offering a smorgasbord of options to the bustling crowds. Hungry workers and office-goers? Yes, ancient Rome had its fair share of bureaucrats, would drop by these vendors to grab a quick meal. Not just for the plebs, the rich occasionally indulged in this street fare, much like today's Wall Street execs sneaking a hot dog on a lunch break. And why not? The offerings range from sausages and bread to more exotic fares like dormice. Yes, the cute little rodents and honey cakes, a sweet treat that probably made the grueling day a tad more bearable. Now, onto the gritty reality of Roman street food hygiene. Let's just say it wasn't a priority. The thermopolia were often cramped, smoky, and in terms of cleanliness, let's call them rustic. The food was prepared and served in open-air stalls, where the dust of the street and the plumes of smoke from the nearby fires freely mingled with the aromas of cooking. The average Roman was likely to have a stronger immune system than a modern-day germaphobe, thanks in part to the city's questionable sanitation practices. The Tiber River, Rome's water source, was a murky cocktail of life and death, carrying everything from trade goods to, well, human waste. But hey, when life gives you lemons, or in this case, the occasional food-borne illness, you make garum. Economics played a huge role in the popularity of street food. The Roman working class, the backbone of the empire, had neither the time nor the resources to indulge in elaborate meals at home. Enter the thermopolia, which offered cheap, ready-to-eat meals that could be gulped down between shifts or during a break. The cost of a simple meal, say a bowl of lentils with bread, might set you back a single as the lowest denomination of Roman currency, roughly equivalent to a few dollars today. For a populace that often lived in cramped insulae, apartment buildings without kitchens, street food was not just a convenience, it was a necessity. But let's not romanticize the street food utopia too much. The bustling markets and food stalls were also scenes of economic disparity. While some vendors thrived, others barely scraped by, competing fiercely for the attention of passers-by. The economic forces of supply and demand were as ruthless then as they are now, dictating everything from the price of a simple loaf of bread to the availability of luxury food items. The rich might have feasted on peacock and ostrich, but the average Roman's diet was far more humble, often centered around grains and legumes. In the end, the thriving street food culture of ancient Rome was a testament to the city's vibrant, if chaotic, urban life. It was a place where the aromas of grilled meats mingled with the cries of hawkers and the clatter of sandals on cobblestones. A world where garum was the king of condiments, and hygiene was more of a hopeful suggestion than a strict rule. So next time you grab a quick bite from a street vendor, think of the long history that's sizzling behind every food stall. After all, even in the shadow of the mighty Colosseum, it was the humble thermopolium that truly fed the Roman soul. Speaking of the humble thermopolium, let's dive into the ingredients that made Roman snacks both tantalizing and, well, a little eyebrow-raising. If you think today's fusion cuisine is unconventional, wait till you hear what the Romans were tossing into their cooking pots. We're talking a culinary mashup that would make even the most adventurous foodies pause. The Roman palate was a wild ride through the Mediterranean pantry, spiced with trade and political ambition. First up, those infamous fish sauces. Garum wasn't the only fishy business in town. There was also alec, a thicker paste, often used by the less moneyed citizens who couldn't afford the liquid luxury of top-shelf garum. This was the Roman version of store brand. Condiments, same fishy punch, a little more grit. Imagine marinating everything from bread to roast dormice in something that smells like a fish market on a hot day. Yum, right? And let's not forget the seasonings. Romans loved to sprinkle their meals with exotic spices like pepper and cumin, which had to travel thousands of miles along trade routes that crisscrossed the known world. Pepper was the ancient world's black gold, imported overland from India. No small feat given the 4,000-mile trek. Think of it as the Roman equivalent of that artisanal Himalayan salt we sprinkle on our avocado toast today. Only in Rome, a pound of pepper could cost as much as 300 denarii, a hefty price for a seasoning that would make your lentil stew pop. But acquiring these spices wasn't just a culinary pursuit, it was a power play. The Roman Empire's insatiable appetite for exotic flavors fueled its expansion. The spice trade routes were not just lines on a map, they were the veins that pumped wealth and influence through the empire. Conquering new territories often meant new access to coveted spices, and controlling these routes was as much about domination as it was about dinner. It was geopolitics served on a platter. Take cinnamon, for instance. Romans believed it came from the land of Arabia, but this aromatic bark actually originated from Sri Lanka and was traded along the perilous routes through the Middle East. The journey was fraught with danger, not just from the treacherous terrain, but from bandits and rival traders. Yet the demand was insatiable. To put it in perspective, a pound of cinnamon could fetch 5,500 denarii, enough to buy a small vineyard. That's a lot of dough for a sprinkle of flavour. Speaking of dough, let's talk grains. Wheat was the backbone of the Roman diet, but it wasn't always easy to come by. Supply chain issues are not just a modern headache. Back in the day, grain shipments from Egypt and North Africa were the lifeblood of Rome, ensuring that the city's famed bread doll, the annona, kept rolling. A hiccup in these shipments could spell disaster, leading to shortages and unrest. Imagine the panic over a delayed shipment of grain. Now multiply that by an empire's worth of hungry mouths. The politics of food were as intricate as the flavors themselves. Grain shortages weren't just bad news for the hungry masses, they were a recipe for political instability. A well-fed populace was a happy populace, and a happy populace was less likely to revolt. This is why emperors like Augustus and later Trajan made sure to keep the annona well stocked, even if it meant subsidizing the cost. Your career as an emperor could hinge on whether or not the bread baskets were full. And what about the rest of the Roman snack menu? Well, let's just say variety was the spice of life. The Romans were not shy about trying new things, from exotic fruits and vegetables imported from the far reaches of the empire to more questionable fare like blood sausages and brain pâté. These dishes may not have made it onto the menus of today's trendy bistros, but they were a testament to the adventurous Roman spirit. Yet, for all this culinary experimentation, the reality was that most Romans ate a diet that would bore a modern palate: grains, legumes, and the occasional fish or chicken. The rich, meanwhile, could indulge in banquets featuring delicacies like flamingo tongues and stuffed dormice, dishes more about ostentation than flavour. These lavish meals were as much about status as they were about sustenance, a chance to show off one's wealth and connections in a grand display of excess. But let's not sugarcoat it. The supply chain had its own share of hiccups. Politics, piracy, and poor weather could all conspire to delay shipments, making certain ingredients as scarce as an honest politician. When the Tiber River froze over, which happened more often than you'd think, it could disrupt the flow of goods into the city, turning a bustling market into a scene of scarcity. In these times, even the humble lentil became a luxury, and the price of bread could skyrocket, proving once again that in Rome, as elsewhere, economics ruled the day. So, as you ponder the Roman snack scene, remember that it was a tapestry woven from threads of trade, politics, and ambition. The flavours that graced Roman tables were not merely culinary choices, they were the result of a vast network of trade, diplomacy, and, occasionally, conquest. In every bite of spiced sausage or honey cake there was a story of empires, economies, and the eternal human quest for something a little bit different. Stay tuned, because there's more to this Epicurean journey through Rome's flavourful past. And speaking of human quests, let's dive into the social circus that was Roman street food culture. In ancient Rome, dining out wasn't just about satisfying hunger, it was a veritable spectator sport. The streets and marketplaces were the original social media feeds, buzzing with gossip, political debate, and the occasional scandal. Street food vendors, or thermopolia, were the ancient equivalents of today's hip pop-up eateries, minus the Instagram influencers, but with plenty of personalities. Picture this, a bustling Roman forum where the air is thick with the scent of sizzling sausages and the chatter of citizens. For the average Roman, grabbing a bite on the go was less like a quick trip to a fast food joint and more akin to attending a neighbourhood block party. Sure, the food was important, but it was the social interaction that kept people coming back for more. It was at these lively stalls that the rich and poor rubbed shoulders, sometimes quite literally, as they jostled for space and attention. Now, let's slice through the myth of Roman excess like a hot knife through butter. The popular image of Romans as decadent gluttons, forever feasting on extravagant banquets, is only part of the story. Yes, the elites indulged in lavish meals that would make the average Roman's head spin. Think peacock tongues and jellyfish salads. But most citizens made do with much humbler fare. The daily diet for the majority consisted of simple dishes like pulls, a porridge made from emmer wheat, and, of course, the ubiquitous bread and olive oil combo. Not exactly the stuff of Epicurean dreams, but it got the job done. In the crowded streets of Rome, food was a great leveller. While the poor often relied on the cheaper street offerings, like lentil stew or chickpea mash, the wealthy wouldn't shy away from sampling these everyday delights. It was a rare moment when economic divides blurred, if only slightly. A labourer might rub elbows with a senator grabbing a quick snack, and though their wallets were worlds apart, for a brief moment, they shared the same culinary experience. It's as if street food created a temporary ceasefire in the class wars. A truce brokered over a bowl of piping hot lentils. But don't mistake this mingling for a social revolution. The rich and powerful still held all the cards, and their dining habits reflected that. While the common folk enjoyed their meals standing or perched on the edge of a fountain, the elites had the luxury of reclining in their villas, attended to by a small army of slaves. Herein lies the culinary paradox of Rome, a city where the same streets could host both the sumptuous feasts of the aristocracy and the humble meals of the masses. Yet, despite these disparities, the street food scene was a vital artery in the body of Roman society. It was here that people gathered not just to eat, but to engage in the vibrant, sometimes unruly, life of the city. Vendors hawked their goods with theatrical flair, shouting out the day's specials or the virtues of their garum blend. It was all part of the performance, a daily drama that played out in the heart of Rome, where everyone was both spectator and participant. The economic engine driving this food frenzy was as complex as the city itself. Rome's population during its peak hovered around 1 million souls, with a significant chunk dependent on the annona, the state's grain dole, to survive. This public assistance program was no mere act of charity. Oh no, it was a strategic move to maintain peace among the plebs and keep the city from descending into chaos. After all, a hungry mob is an angry mob, and no emperor wanted to face a bread riot on an empty stomach. So, while the rich splurged on exotic spices and imported delicacies, the everyday Roman relied on the steady supply of subsidized grain. It was the backbone of their diet, and any disruption in the supply chain could spell disaster. Political unrest, pirate raids on grain ships, or even a bad harvest could turn the city into a powder keg of discontent. Nothing kept an emperor awake at night quite like the thought of his citizens going hungry. In this high-stakes game of supply and demand, food was more than just sustenance, it was a tool of power and control. The emperors knew that controlling the food supply was akin to controlling the people, and they wielded this power with the precision of a seasoned politician. It was a delicate dance, balancing the needs of the masses with the extravagances of the elite, ensuring that both had enough to keep them content, or at least distracted. And let's not forget the role of the humble thermopolium in this grand narrative. These street vendors were the unsung heroes of the Roman culinary scene, providing quick, affordable meals to those who couldn't afford the luxury of time or resources to cook at home. For many Romans, the thermopolium was a lifeline, a place where they could grab a meal and catch up on the latest news, all while dodging the chaos of urban life. In a city where the gap between rich and poor was often as wide as the Tiber, street food offered a rare taste of equality. It was a space where the barriers of class could be momentarily set aside, where everyone, regardless of status, could enjoy the simple pleasure of a hot meal. But make no mistake, this was no utopia. The social hierarchies of Rome were as deeply entrenched as the cobblestones underfoot, and even in the bustling marketplace, the power dynamics were never far from view. So, as we chew over the social dynamics of Roman dining, remember that every bite of street food was part of a larger story, a story of power, privilege, and the eternal dance between the haves and have-nots. And while the myth of Roman excess might be tempting to swallow, the reality was far more complex. A tale of survival and strategy, played out in the noisy, aromatic streets of one of history's greatest cities. Stay tuned, because the feast is far from over, and there are still plenty of courses to come in our epic exploration of Rome's culinary past. As we navigate the bustling streets of ancient Rome with its chaos of aromas and chatter, let's pivot our gaze from the vibrant thermopolia to the shadowy corridors of power where the real culinary dramas unfolded. You see, the Roman food scene wasn't just about what was being ladled into clay bowls. It was also about the political puppeteers pulling the strings behind the scenes. And boy, did they have a lot on their plate. The Roman elite, ever the strategists, understood that controlling food was akin to holding the keys to the city. The grain dole, or annona, was more than a social welfare program. It was a political chess piece. By keeping the plebs well fed, emperors could maintain a semblance of peace and prevent insurrections. But this wasn't a straightforward task. The logistics of supplying grain to 1 million hungry Romans made modern supply chain headaches look like a Sunday picnic. Let's talk about the regulations. Yes, the Romans had them. Imagine that. The Lex Claudia of 218 BCE, for instance, banned senators from owning large ships, aiming to curb their influence over grain imports. Senators were notorious for monopolizing the grain trade, jacking up prices, and then playing the hero by selling it back at a discount. It was a classic case of create a problem, then sell the solution. Sound familiar? It's not so different from some modern-day corporate antics. As for the scandals, they came in all flavors. Take the infamous case of the Great Grain Scandal of the 1st century BCE, a time when the Roman Republic was teetering on the edge of chaos. The culprit? A group of shady grain merchants who hoarded stocks to drive up prices. The result? Bread riots that made today's Black Friday sales look like polite tea parties. In response, the Senate, ever reactive, rolled out regulations to prevent such hoarding. But loopholes, like cockroaches, are eternal survivors. Speaking of survivors, let's introduce you to Marcus Licinius Crassus, Rome's wealthiest man, whose fortune was partly built on, you guessed it, the food trade. This guy was the Jeff Bezos of ancient Rome, minus the space rockets. Crassus mastered the art of acquiring properties that had conveniently caught fire, thanks to his private fire brigade. But his knack for profiting didn't stop at real estate. He exploited grain shortages to sell at sky-high prices, cementing his status not just as a business mogul, but a puppet master in the political arena. And then there was the issue of quality control or lack thereof. The Romans might have pioneered many things, but food safety wasn't one of them. The infamous lead poisoning from improperly stored wine is one tale that's as alarming as it is true. Lead-based containers were the norm, and while it's a romantic notion to imagine Romans sipping their vino in marble-clad dining rooms, the reality was a silent, creeping health hazard. Imagine today's food recalls, but with a much higher mortality rate. Fraud wasn't just limited to wine. Bread, the staple of Roman diets, was often adulterated. Bakers would mix in cheaper ingredients like chalk or sawdust to bulk up their loaves, a practice that would make modern-day food inspectors faint. The government eventually cracked down, instituting the Collegium Pistorum, a guild of bakers who were supposed to ensure quality. But as with any regulation, enforcement was spotty, and corruption was as common as the daily bread. And what about the political agendas? Well, food was a tool of diplomacy as much as it was a weapon of war. Control the grain supply, and you could bend the will of entire cities. Julius Caesar understood this all too well. His decision to divert grain shipments away from rebellious provinces was less about logistics and more about sending a pointed message: comply or starve. It's a move straight out of the How to Rule an Empire playbook. But it wasn't just the emperors who used food as a political cudgel. The Senate, always keen to maintain its dwindling power, would often use grain shortages to undermine the emperor's authority. Imagine the Senate spreading rumors of grain scarcity just to make the emperor look incompetent. The resulting panic would cause prices to skyrocket, and the emperor, scrambling to restore order, would be left holding the proverbial empty bag. Talk about a political hot potato. So, what's the takeaway from this culinary carnival of corruption and control? The Roman food scene was as much about power plays as it was about pastries. Behind every loaf of bread and every splash of garum was a web of intrigue and influence, a reminder that food has always been a currency in the human economy of control and compliance. As we chew over these historical morsels, it's clear that the politics of the plate have always been as complex as the dishes themselves. And as we prepare to delve deeper into the Roman culinary saga, remember that the story of food is never just about sustenance. It's about survival, strategy, and sometimes sheer skullduggery. So, stay tuned for more as we continue to unravel the deliciously complicated tapestry of Rome's food history. It's time to consider how ancient Roman snack culture has left its greasy fingerprints all over today's fast food industry. Yes, folks, when you grab that burger or scarf down some fries, you're essentially channeling your inner Roman, and you didn't even need a toga. Let's start with the obvious parallel. The Thermopolium, those bustling street food stalls, were the OG fast food joints. While they lacked the neon signs and drive-through windows of today's burger palaces, they served the same purpose: quick, affordable food for people on the go. Ancient Rome was a bustling metropolis, and just like modern city dwellers, Romans needed to eat something that didn't require a 3-hour siesta. Enter the Thermopolium, which provided meals that were as convenient as they were essential. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of grabbing a slice of pizza between meetings. Fast forward a couple of millennia, and the concept of street food has exploded into a global phenomenon, from New York hot dog carts to Bangkok's night markets. And speaking of innovations, let's not forget the Roman contribution to the world's favorite condiment, fermented fish sauce. While garum might not be topping your fries today, its modern descendants, like Worcestershire sauce and certain Asian fish sauces, carry on its pungent legacy. The Romans were masters of umami before it was cool, using this sauce to add depth to their dishes. This culinary prowess laid the groundwork for today's condiment culture, where a squirt of something special can transform the mundane into the magnificent, or at least edible. But it's not just the food itself that has echoes in today's fast food industry, it's the entire experience. Roman street vendors knew how to work a crowd with theatrical flair, shouting out their specials and competing for customers in a cacophony that would give any modern food market a run for its money. This was marketing before the digital age, and it worked. Today, we might have Instagram influencers and flashy ads, but the essence is the same: catch the eye, tantalize the taste buds, and keep them coming back for more. Now, let's talk economics. The Romans understood the power of supply and demand long before Adam Smith penned The Wealth of Nations. They knew that controlling food prices and availability was essential for maintaining social harmony, or at least preventing a good, old-fashioned riot. Fast food chains today similarly rely on strategic pricing and supply chains to keep their empire-like networks running smoothly. When your Big Mac is the same price whether you're in New York or Tokyo, you can thank Roman efficiency and logistics for setting the stage. And what about the social aspect of dining? In ancient Rome, street food wasn't just about the grub. It was a chance to socialize, gossip, and maybe even catch the latest gladiator match results. Today, grabbing a bite has retained this social function, whether it's fast food with friends or food trucks at festivals. The communal aspect of eating remains a staple of human interaction, proving that some things never change, even when the menu does. Of course, it wasn't all sunshine and garum. The Romans, like us, faced the consequences of indulgence. They had their share of food-related health issues, from lead poisoning courtesy of their winemaking prowess, to the occasional digestive distress from questionable street food hygiene. Fast forward to today, and we see echoes of these issues in the ongoing debates about fast food nutrition and health. The more things change, the more they stay the same, right? And here's a little myth-busting for you, the notion of Romans as perpetual gourmands, gluttonously feasting on exotic delicacies, often overshadows the reality of their diet. While the wealthy might have indulged in peacock tongues, the average Roman was more likely to munch on lentils and bread. Similarly, today's fast food joints might boast newfangled creations like the artisanal truffle burger, but more often than not, it's the humble cheeseburger that reigns supreme. It seems that in both ancient and modern times, culinary pragmatism often trumps extravagance. So, what's the takeaway from this historical smorgasbord? Simply put, our love affair with fast food is nothing new. The Romans laid the groundwork, and we've been building on it ever since. From street vendors to global chains, the legacy of Roman snack culture is alive and well, reminding us that convenience, flavor, and a bit of showmanship will always have a place at the table. Whether you're grabbing a hot dog on the corner or indulging in some late-night drive-through, you're part of a tradition that stretches back thousands of years. As we wrap up this culinary journey through time, let's raise a metaphorical glass of garum to the Romans, the original purveyors of fast food. Their innovations in street dining not only nourished a city, but also laid the groundwork for a worldwide phenomenon. So, next time you bite into a greasy slice or unwrap a paper-wrapped burger, take a moment to appreciate the ancient legacy behind modern cravings. After all, even in the whirlwind of today's fast-paced world, the simple pleasure of a quick bite remains a constant, a testament to the enduring appeal of those bustling Roman streets. And remember, whether it's a toga or a tracksuit, we're all just looking for that next delicious fix.